All right, it looks like we have quorum. Kelly, could we do a roll call, please?
Yes. Councillor Brockington.
Here.
Councillor Cluche. Councillor Curry. Here. Councillor Dudas. Here. Councillor Hughley.
Here.
Councillor Kitts.
Here.
Councillor Leeper.
Good morning.
Councillor Menard.
Here.
Councillor Tierney. I don't see Councillor Tierney. Co-Chair Moffat.
Here.
Co-Chair Gower.
Here.
And Councillor El Shantiri. I don't see him either. You have quorum.
Thank you, Kelly. Good morning, everyone. This is meeting number 58 of the Planning Committee for Thursday, March 10th. We acknowledge that Ottawa is located on unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, whose culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. Il est important de souligner que la ville d'Ottawa se trouve sur un territoire non cédé de la nation algonquine Anishinaabe, dont la culture et la présence sont enrichies et continuent d'enrichir ces terres. This is a public meeting to consider the proposed comprehensive official plan and zoning bylaw amendments listed as items 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9, and 10 on today's agenda. For the items just mentioned, only those who make oral submissions today or written submissions before the amendments are adopted may appeal the matter to the Ontario Land Tribunal. In addition, the applicant may appeal the matter to the Ontario Land Tribunal if council does not adopt an amendment within 90 days of receipt of the application for a zoning bylaw amendment and 120 days for an official plan amendment. To submit written comments on these amendments prior to their consideration by City Council on March 23rd, 2022, please email or call the committee or council coordinator. Are there any declarations of interest this morning? Seeing none. Confirmation of the minutes for meeting number 57 on February 24th, 2022. Are the minutes confirmed?
Confirmed.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to go through the agenda and we will hold any items that have delegations registered or questions from our committee members. The first one is the City of Ottawa's response to the Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force report recommendations. We have several speakers signed up for that one, so we will hold that item, number one. Item number 2 is the High Performance Development Standard Report. And again, we have speakers registered, so we will hold item number 2.
Chair, I'm sorry, there's somebody shuffling papers or something in the background. I don't know if somebody can go on mute. Oh, there we go.
Okay. Item number 3, official plan amendment for Manor Park North and Manor Park South. And there are speakers registered, so we will hold item number 3. Item number 4 is an official plan amendment and zoning bylaw amendment for 112 Montreal Road and 314 Gardner Street. There is one delegation registered, so we will hold that one. And what I'm going to do, just because this item has one delegation, we'll consider it ahead of the Manor Park item, just so that we can release our staff and be respectful of the delegation's time. So we'll consider that ahead of Manor Park. And same with items 5 and 6, official plan amendment and zoning amendment for 50 the driveway and a heritage approach for 50 the driveway. We have 2 delegations registered, so we'll hold that item, but we'll consider it ahead of the Manor Park item. Okay, we'll keep going here. Item number 7 is a zoning bylaw amendment for 5957 and 5969 Fernbank Road in Stittsville. We have no delegations. Are there any questions from the committee on this one or any reason to hold it? Don Schultz is here from Kavanaugh Developments. Don, if the committee is ready to carry this item, do you need to speak on it?
I believe he's just being led into the room.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have no reason to present any information if there are no questions.
Okay, thank you, Don. I want to note this is quite a long process. I remember attending the public meeting for this when it was first submitted back in spring 2018, and here we are nearly 4 years later at Planning Committee. So these things take time sometimes, and we'll be talking a bit about that in the housing report item. So for zoning bylaw amendment for 5957 and 5969 Fernbank Road, are the report recommendations carried?
Carried.
Carried.
Carried. Okay. The next one is number 8, zoning bylaw amendment for 4623 Spratt Road in Gloucester, South Nepean. There are no delegations registered. I believe the planner is here. Do we need to hold this item? Are there any questions from committee members? So I'm not even sure if we have an applicant registered for this one. Do we, Kelly? No? Okay. Well, if there's no questions and no delegations, is this report carried?
Carried.
Carried.
Carried. Okay. Number 9 is a zoning bylaw amendment for 879 River Road in Gloucester, South Nepean. There are no delegations registered. We do have the applicant here. There's a technical motion that Councillor Moffat has for this one. So let's introduce that technical motion.
Thank you. This is to revise a portion, the zoning on a portion of the site. So whereas the report recommends zoning changes to the lands known municipally as 879 River Road, and whereas through discussions with the applicant it has been deemed advisable to make certain changes to the zoning provisions, as it has been determined that the back-to-back townhouse units proposed in the draft approved subdivision are not able to conform to the zoning standards of the R4 zone, R4Z zone, and whereas separate zoning provisions are required to ensure that back-to-back townhouses can be constructed as planned, therefore be it resolved that the following changes be made to the report. 1, replace recommendation 1 with the following. The Planning Committee recommend Council approve an amendment to zoning bylaw 2008-250 for 879 River Road for development reserved to residential 4th density and residential 3rd density subzone Z, exception 2059 R3Z 2059, to permit low-rise residential development as detailed in document 2. 2, replace document 1 with the attached map, and assume if you're listening there is an attached map. 3, replace document 2 with the following. Proposed changes to the comprehensive zoning bylaw 1, the zoning map of the city of Ottawa, zoning bylaw 2008-250 is amended by changing the zoning of the lands known municipally as 879 River Road from development reserved to the 4th residential 4th density subzone Z R4Z and residential 3rd density subzone Z, exception 2059 R3Z 2059. Therefore be it resolved, further resolved, that there be no further notice pursuant to section 3417 of the Planning Act.
Thank you, Scott. So we have the 2 representatives from the applicant, Farouz Wahab from Richcraft and Eric Bays from Stantec. I want to ask them if the committee is prepared to carry this item. Do you wish to speak today on it?
Richcraft doesn't wish to speak if the committee has no issues with the motion as presented.
Okay, thank you, Farouz. Is the motion from Councillor Moffat carried?
Carried.
And are the report recommendations as amended carried?
Carried.
Carried, thank you. Okay, item number 10 is a zoning bylaw amendment for 170 Lees Avenue in Capital Ward. There are no delegations registered. Are there any committee questions or anyone who wants to hold this item? Okay, I would like to ask the applicant. We have Barrett Wager from Stantec and Doug McLean on behalf of the property owner with us. If the committee is ready to carry this item, do you wish to speak to committee?
Good morning, Mr. Chair. If there are no questions for us, we're happy to proceed.
Okay, thank you. Then are the report recommendations for 170 Lees Avenue carried?
Carried.
Okay. And then item number 11 is the 2021 annual report pursuant to the Building Code Act. Does anyone wish to hold this item? Okay, is the report received?
Received.
Received. Okay, so we will go back to the start of our agenda with the items that we have held. The first item is the City of Ottawa's response to the Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force report recommendations. Steve Willis has a short presentation to lead us off, and then we'll go to our delegations. Good morning, Steve. You are on mute, Steve.
I think I'd have that by now. Chairs and members of committee, thanks for the opportunity to speak today on the report in front of you. We have a very short presentation, and I'll ask clerk's office to put that up. But before I actually begin the presentation, I want to give you some quick context piece before we begin. So first of all, this is the city staff's recommended response to the province on a report of the Housing Affordability Task Force. So it's not yet legislation. It's just a series of recommendations the task force has given the province. And the province, we understand, will introduce legislation very soon before the end of this sitting of the legislature. And so we felt it urgent to get this matter before you as quickly as possible so that the city's position was in writing. We don't know whether the province would adopt all 55 recommendations or some of them. So that's why it's important that council take a position on this. So our hope today is that council takes the staff position and then makes it council's position on this so we can communicate that to the province with the report recommendations. I want to thank Megan Brody from our Economic Development and Long Range Planning Group who assisted me in pulling this report together in a hurry. We did act very quickly, and I really thank Megan. I couldn't have done this report without her support. And I also thank our colleagues in the rest of the department and our colleagues in Housing Services in the Finance Department and the City Treasurer, CFO as well, because we needed their support to pull this together. I want to put some context to the task force. So we are seeing a very unprecedented surge in housing prices in Ontario, in Canada, and in North America. So it's not just an Ottawa thing. It's not just an Ontario thing. It's all through North America. And we've sat through and we've tracked this, informally and through published sources, through banks and other reliable sources. And there are a number of factors that are driving this right now. And I think it's important to talk about the factors driving the surge in housing prices. One, there's 6 different factors we've identified. One is demographics, because we have essentially baby boomers still in their houses at the same time millennials are buying houses. So we have 2 very large demographic groups at exactly the same time in the housing market, and there isn't the natural migration of people through the system. So that's one factor. The second factor, and that's a factor we saw coming, the demographic projections have always seen that coming, so that is not a surprise. The second factor that actually is a surprise is that we are seeing migration into Ontario in particular to be much higher than we anticipated. And there are early signs that the Ministry of Finance's projections for migration into Ontario were under predicted. And there are 2 factors driving that migration. One is federal policy and immigration to Canada, but I think a bigger factor, it's a bit of a sleeper factor we didn't see coming, was intra-provincial migration into Ontario. So as Ontario and Quebec particularly are seen as very economically strong areas of the country, we're seeing more people coming to Ontario. And this is the same trend Alberta faced many years ago, but it has reversed and switched course. The third factor are financial factors, such as low cost of borrowing, stress test rules. These are also factors in housing affordability. The additional factor is the pandemic effect of people wishing to trade up, because as they decide to, they're stuck in their houses and get dissatisfied with what they've got in terms of their lifestyle needs, they want more. And so we've seen a lot of trading up in the local marketplace in Ottawa in the last couple of years. There are financialization factors, such as investments in housing to go through platforms that aren't traditional. So, as opposed to sale or rental, which are traditional tools, we have short-term arrangements and other types of trusts and financialization of the commodity there. And then the big factor also is labor shortages and those effects on and material shortages. And those are the effects on construction in the short term, and those are pandemic driven and also demographic driven, because there is a shortage of skilled trades. So, we get about 6,500 to 7,000 units a year built in Ottawa, but to meet what the province suggests of probably going up to about 10,000 units a year in Ottawa, the labor force doesn't exist in this region to support that level of construction activity. The third point I want to make, a theme on this, is this report, task force report, is not talking really about housing for low-income Ontarians. This is about market level housing. So notwithstanding the Housing Task Force's focus and title, there are a few recommendations related to low income Ontarians, but that is not the focus of this report. The next point I'd like to make as a context is, Council, in an almost unanimous vote, made substantial changes to its official plan recently that are very much in line with the recommendations of this task force, but we did it on our own. Council did it on its own. Council did it the Ottawa way and customize it to local conditions. And so, you'll see a theme in our report, which is, we did the right thing, and we've done many of these things, and we think local autonomy is really important, because we think through the official plan, we've had a public debate in Ottawa about how to do these things. And finally, we're very mindful as a department about our role in the affordability of any development and the process sides of it. And it's a difficult trade-off, because we still believe we have very important functions, as does council, in the decision making, and we provide our advice to council, and council makes the decisions. And a lot of the work that gets done in local planning put in two big buckets. One is fit of a new project, and the second is the functionality of a new project. The fit is the architectural style, the character, the appeal of it, those sorts of things. But there's also the functionality, like, does the drainage work, does the servicing work, and in the traffic conditions and the like, and how does this fit into this mobility issue? So those are functionality components, and we believe there's important value added by the city planning process on both of those two main themes. We fully acknowledge we have choke points in our process, and we're bringing our annual report on development activity, I think, in about a month, and we're going to talk further about what we're trying to do on those choke points. And some of that has a problem that there are process issues, there's staffing resource issues, there are a number of issues that contribute to that, but we're very mindful of that, and we're really striving for continuous improvement. But finally, just on a personal level, I'm very conscious of what this does to people who want to buy new houses. I mean, the last time we had a big surge like this were in the 1990s, late 90s, and I was a prospective home owner at the time, and I know what that did in terms of our housing choices and limited options at that time. So I know how this plays out to people on the ground. I'm also a parent of two young adults, and I know that the privilege I have, that my kids probably will never be able to afford the house that I live in. So that is a reality, and we're very, very mindful of that. But again, the municipality's control of all the factors is fairly limited in the report, in terms of what needs to be done. So with that, clerk's office, if we could just put out the presentation, I just want to highlight the key points of the report. Next slide, please. So the task force was appointed by the province to find real solutions to quickly address supply in the Ontario housing market. And really what they're targeting is a housing supply increase of 1.5 million new homes over 10 years. And this has led to 55 recommendations, and the staff report responds to each of the 55 recommendations. And just really quickly, I think about 72% of the recommendations the city either fully supports or supports with some qualification on how it actually plays out. It's not that we disagree with the recommendations, we've suggested some nuance to them. And about 8 of them, we support the underlying premise of the recommendation, but don't think the recommendation itself is the tool in response to the issue the task force has recommended. So the areas of disagreement are actually quite narrow. So we have 11 recommendations the city does not support, and 4 we had no comment on. So next slide, please. So areas of agreement, for example, the province has suggested there needs to be a limit on exclusionary zoning practices in municipalities through binding provincial action. And there are tools such as the provincial policy statement. And as I said, we tackled much of this in the official plan debate. And we have our zoning bylaw to do that will implement that. But I believe council has made some brave decisions to try to tackle this issue in the plan we recently did. Secondly, Ottawa has for many years permitted, as of right, secondary suites, garden suites, and laneway houses, and the province wants to make this province-wide. We already have these broad permissions in place in Ottawa and had for a while, and see no downside of this being rolled out province-wide. And there are recommendations about providing provincial and federal loan guarantees for purpose-built rental, and affordable ownership projects, and we do believe the action in that area is absolutely needed. Next slide, please. Areas of concern. So basically, to boil down, a common theme throughout this is, while the city supports tackling, on a province-wide basis, limiting exclusionary zoning practices, we don't want an outright override of municipal planning approvals powers, because council should have discretion to apply these techniques on a local basis. And the city has done a lot of work to look at preservation of physical character of neighborhoods. It's still work that needs to be improved. There's always areas we can improve on that. We know hearing concerns to the official plan process related to front yards and trees, for example. There's work to be done on this, but this should be done locally in local context. And we don't want to lose the tools we have under the zoning provisions of the Planning Act and site plan to do that. Secondly, the major theme is that the province is the task force is proposing major changes to the Heritage Act provisions, and the city simply does not believe that those are appropriate. The province made major changes under Bill 108, which we're only now getting into, and those changes in Bill 108 gave many more powers to property owners with respect to heritage designations, and we think some time should play out to see if those changes previously adopted by the province will actually address the problem of concern, and the city does not support further changes to the Heritage Act as recommended by the task force. Because basically the city disagrees with the premise that heritage designations deteriorate property value and that the city would owe compensation in that area, and that would be detrimental to the city. Next slide, please. The city also does not believe in legislative timelines, approved by X date, or if we don't, it's automatically approved. Right now, there are appeal rights if we take too long in the process. So there is a checks and balance in the system as it is today. The timelines as they exist don't even match the mandatory circulation requirements, and there would have to be a massive rethink, and we don't think that's the best use of the province's legislative powers to go down that road. We would recommend they focus elsewhere. And the city is also very concerned about waiving development charges, parkland cash in lieu for smaller units. They still are an important contributor to the costs providing necessary services to accommodate growth in the city. And as our new official plan contemplates more and more infill through smaller scale developments, it would be very detrimental to what we just did in the official plan, because otherwise the burden for providing those services would be shifted to the general tax base. So I won't show the remaining slide because it's really about the next steps. We'll go right to Chair. I'll return it back to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Steve. So we'll come back to you after delegations for questions to you and to staff on this item. So we will move to our delegations. We have, looks like 9 delegations signed up. First 3 are Dean Tester, John Dance, and Patrick Sylvain. So we'll start with Dean Tester. Is Dean with us?
There he is.
Morning, everybody.
Good morning, Dean. So
Thanks
Dean,
so much.
yeah, everyone this morning has 5 minutes, and then there'll be an opportunity for committee members to ask you questions as well. So go ahead, Dean.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So my name is Dean Tester. I'm the co-founder of a group called Make Housing Affordable. I'm here today to speak in favor of the recommendations in the Housing Affordability Task Force in an opposition to some of the draft report proposed by the City of Ottawa. I think we all know we have a housing crisis in Ottawa, and as Steve Willis said, it's not just us, but it's definitely affecting us. The city has acknowledged this by adopting an emergency motion on housing and homelessness. We've seen housing prices double in the last 5 years. We know how tough it is for first-time home buyers right now. I've talked to several councillors, and we just heard this from Steve Willis. people who are in their homes today would have no hope of buying those homes if they didn't purchase, years ago. My personal experience, I'm currently looking for a home with my wife. The last home we bid on was a small 40-year-old condo in Canada. It was listed at $350,000 and it sold for $575,000. So I can't even begin to tell you how unattainable that is. And that's a starter condo. It's not a greenfield home. It's not a new development. So that's the struggle we're facing. And we also know the biggest problem we face is the lack of supply. Ottawa, compared to other G7 cities, we need to build 70,000 housing units overnight. If we just wanted to be an average city, we're way below where we should be. And especially when you consider the landmass we have in Ottawa, we are not a dense city at all. There is so much room for intensification and growth. And so I wanted to reflect on some of the ways that I think the city's planning process has failed us so far. And I want to preface this by saying, I know there's a lot of really good people on this planning committee. I've met with a lot of you. I've met with people in the city planning office. I appreciate their efforts. You all have the community's best interests at heart. And I know that's why many of you will support this motion to protect the city's planning powers from the provincial government. But I just want to share a few examples of how I see that this is just not working for most people. So we've recently approved an official plan that estimates the city will grow by about 400,000 people in the next 25 years. And we set a housing target to match that. The province is estimating that number is closer to 500,000. And we just heard a presentation by Steve Willis suggesting that the provincial estimates are actually low. So if we don't have a proper estimate, how can we build enough housing? And will we be building enough housing to match that growth in population? And if our current plan is to maintain the status quo in terms of home per capita, and our population grows by more than planned, how much worse is our population, or how much worse is our housing crisis going to get? A few other examples. I spoke to one counselor who told me about a frivolous complaint made against a small development, type of thing that happens all the time. The complaint was dismissed instantly, but it took over a year. It cost the developer $1 million in legal fees and increased building costs. And those costs were, of course, passed on to home buyers. A few minutes ago, we heard about a development approved 4 years ago, 4 years after the project was announced. And these homes in that time probably doubled in price. Before you take into account the legal efforts and lobbying efforts the developer probably had to undertake to get that approval. Later today, you're debating 50 The Driveway, where the city has used the threat of a heritage designation to force the Canadian Nurses Association to change their plans to develop that property, delaying an important housing project by months and undoubtedly adding significant costs. We're going to hear about Manor Park. I understand there was an attempt to put a heritage designation there. People are using the planning process to delay projects they don't like. And the worst example, and this one really hits home for me. I met with a city councillor who told me that they opposed the Allegra Baffin project, which is meant to create a new boarding home for people traveling to Ottawa from Nunavut for emergency health care. And this councillor told me they opposed the project because they thought it would bring homeless Indigenous people into their neighborhood. Well, publicly, they said that they were concerned about traffic impacts and green space implications. That's not what this planning process is for. And that broke me, and I'm still very upset about it. And that's why I'm here today. Our city planning process is broken. It's delaying projects by months or years and adding tremendous costs. It's dramatically increasing the difficulty of small builds like duplexes or triplexes, which should be available to property owners by rights. We have councillors.
Can you wrap up, please?
Yeah, sure. My main problem is we have councillors who use the zoning process as a political weapon to try and win votes for the next election. And we have other councillors who use it to openly discriminate against certain communities. I'm afraid that this is the process that you guys are fighting to protect today. So I urge you to go back to the drawing board, find a way to work with the province and support the recommendations of this task force. Do not go to battle with the province to protect a planning system that is driving our city's housing crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. Are there any questions from committee members? Councillor Menard.
Sure, I'll ask some questions. Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Dean, for being here. And I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to meet before Wednesday. I saw your message come in. It's been crazy, but I appreciate your engagement throughout the official plan and the urban boundary discussions, and then this piece as well, and your social media engagement. I do want to talk about the affordable housing piece, because you mentioned the housing and homelessness emergency that we had declared. In the report that the province has produced, they specifically mentioned that their mandate was only on market housing supply, and that they state in their report affordable housing units provided at below market rates with government support was not part of our mandate. So I'm just wondering what you think about that. Was that a missed opportunity?
Yeah, thank you, Sean. So, I mean, the task force clearly got their direction from the province, and the province wanted them to look at market rate housing affordability rather than affordable housing, right? And these are two very important concepts. I don't think they compete with each other. I think we need to be doing a lot more on both of them. You know, I would love to see this city work more with the provincial and federal government to secure funding for affordable housing. I know there's an affordable housing development going in my backyard out here in Barrhaven. The city, I think, gave the land for $2 or something like that. It sounds great. Like, I wish there were more projects like that. I hope the city continues to go down that avenue. But, you know, the challenge is market rate housing has become so unaffordable that, you know, I make, you know, about $100,000 a year. I do very well for myself. I'm very privileged. I acknowledge that privilege. I can't afford a house. So I'm competing for rentals with people who are on minimum wage or working part-time or just starting their career, or people with young families to feed. And, you know, that drives up the cost for everybody. You know, it's not just affecting potential home buyers, it's affecting renters, it's affecting minority communities who are the most disadvantaged by the planning process. It's an equity issue that affects everyone. And I very much appreciate that, and I agree. Housing is unaffordable. Absolutely. Take your point. It is the reason why we're discussing these things and how we talk about affordable housing on a regular basis, because it is unaffordable. How we get to that solution is the question I have, right? And that's really the piece we're talking about right now, the supply side. And we don't talk a lot about the supercharged demand side either. And I wish we did more often, because new home buyers represent a fairly small percentage of folks purchasing homes. It's about a quarter to a third. And so what we're seeing is that large demand come from existing homeowners who are buying new places, and the financialization of housing through large corporate interests. So I just wonder, on that point, on the demand side, do you see issues, on the demand side, do you see issues there outside of just, free for all allowing on the supply side? What are your concerns about the demand side when it comes to affordability of housing? Yeah, thanks, Sean. So it's a good question. And, I've seen a lot of arguments on this side, and I don't necessarily agree with a lot of them. The biggest trope that I see on the demand side is that it's coming from, foreign ownership or foreign buyers. And I don't think the statistics borne that out. And I think it's a lot of finger pointing and people looking for a scapegoat in this. And it's very easy to blame foreigners, right? And unfortunately, that's the way our federal discourse was in the last election. We had three parties arguing with each other over which one hated foreign buyers more, right? And it's such a small part of the market. To your point about people switching properties or looking to upgrade, or to move, or people's circumstance changes over time. First-time home buyers are not the only people affected by this. I spoke yesterday with someone who had gone through a divorce. She'd owned a house with her partner, and when they split, she lost all her equity. And she had lived in a house for most of her life, and now she's told me she's never going to be able to afford a house again, right? And so those people are hurt by this too, So, while I'm largely speaking from the perspective of a first-time home buyer, there are much bigger impacts of this housing crisis on anyone who's interested in home ownership. And I will just add too that the gap between people who own homes and people who own property and people who don't is accelerating at a pace that we've never seen. I mean, my personal story is 5 years ago, I had the money to buy a house. I instead decided to open a business instead. My wage has basically doubled since then, but I could buy a house then. I can't now. That's how fast housing has grown. That's a real struggle. I talk to anyone in my age group, my friend group, people with good incomes, people making as a family, $100,000, $150,000, and they're saying, I'm going to be a renter for life. And that's really difficult for us to accept when, we grew up thinking, get a good job, go to school, work hard, and you're going to have the same thing your parents did, and we don't.
Thank you for that. And my last question, just on the demand side, is would you support the removal of the taxation exemption on capital gains for homes that are sold for your principal residence?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. It's a good question. I honestly, I don't know enough about that. Yeah, I couldn't tell you. I don't have a strong opinion on that. Sorry.
Okay, it speaks heavily to the demand side of things. So I appreciate you being here. Thanks again, Dean.
Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, Sean. Councillor Curry.
Thanks, Dean. Thank you very much for your comments, your honesty, and your braveness, really, for coming and saying some of the things you said. It's really helpful to have real conversations at this table. I'm wondering a couple things. Your group, would you be giving any feedback from your group on behalf of your group, or you specifically to the province on this?
So right now we're heavily focused on municipal politics. The provincial election is obviously coming. So we may be engaging in the provincial election as well. Sorry, is that what you're asking?
On this report, though, do you think your group would say, actually, we agree with everything that this task force report has said?
Yeah, I think, I'm not a subject matter expert on everything in that report. I mean, I'm someone who's very passionate about the housing crisis. So I don't want to speak to every single nuance, but broadly, they identified the issue the way that I identify the issue. The solutions they proposed are solutions that I proposed. I work and collaborate with like-minded groups in Toronto, and they issued their own report before this report came out, and it was very much in line with what the task force recommended. So yes, I would say the short answer is yes. I very much support the report, and I'm looking forward to seeing what the province actually tables in their legislation.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad that you're going to do that you would contemplate doing that. When you listen to what Steve Willis said about the 6 factors, I feel like when I look at the task force report, this is only one thing. Like whatever happens with this task force report and what they go forward with is not going to solve this problem. And you sort of had a list at the beginning of your presentation of things you thought also needed to be done that were complicated by our planning processes in this committee and everything else. But I'm wondering if you have other ideas, because this is not going to solve the problem on its own. And you look at the projection 10 years out that we'll get 1.5 more million houses. By that time, when you think about the factors that Steve Willis listed, this is not going to do it. I'm wondering if you have any other specific recommendations as well.
Yeah, I think the number one most important thing we can do is ending the exclusionary zoning practices. And to the credit of the city of Ottawa, I had spoken to some planning staff about this, and it sounded like they were working towards adopting a version of that. So very, very enthusiastic and happy that they were already headed down that path. I'm curious because I know they're not opposed to the provincial recommendation on that front, except in the sense that they kind of like to do their own version of that. So I'd be curious to hear in more detail how what the city's proposing differs from what the province is proposing. I don't know if we're far enough down that path to have that discussion yet, but I would like to know that. And I think one thing I'd really like to know as well is what is the city's population estimate, and has it changed since the official plan process? And how are we going to change our estimate of houses we need to build to compensate? Because when I looked at that number, I think the city says in a lot of the right things in terms of building out the missing middle and supporting some moderate greenfield development, but primarily focusing on intensification. We have a huge landmass in this city. There is so much room for intensification. If you looked at our city from an aerial view, if you were at Parliament Hill, you'd be like, wow, our city is tall. But anywhere else, you'd say we have a flat city, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like there is not a lot of towers in our city. I would love to see us adopt more aggressive policies towards that. And like, how can we get, if someone wants to turn their, McMansion into a fourplex that, is more affordable housing for multiple people, how do we allow that by right rather than having to go through a complicated planning process that delays it by a year or more, and you have to hire lobbyists and planners and everything else.
Mm-hmm. I thank you. We have a long meeting today, but I really appreciate your comments for sure. And you look at the different motions on this agenda here that are almost competing in some ways. And I think this is quite a complex issue, but I really appreciate your feedback here today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Councillor.
Thanks, Kathy. Councillor Tim Tierney is up next.
Great. Thank you, co-chair. Dean, I want to thank you. I've been listening intently to a lot of your discussions on radio about the concerns. And it's got to be difficult because you're speaking here with 23 millionaires, because let's face it, all our houses that we own are in that zone. But we also do have children. I see people nodding their heads, but stop it. It's a problem. And we have to face this situation head on. Those of us that have decided to have families, it's a concern. And I hear what you're saying about, will our children be able to afford housing in the future? I think our greatest concern the next municipal election is going to look at housing affordability. And again, the impact assessment's been pushed off. So where the desirable communities are within our city to live and what kind of increase is going to come to play. So on that note, you have made many, many good points today. One of them, I just want to check with you. If you can't buy a home in our city, and you've clearly stated that point, it's a problem for a lot of us, my children included, what would you do? Would you buy outside of the city, and what would the impacts of that be on our city?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's so important because I think that's where our city's headed, unfortunately. Yeah, I've looked at Carleton Place, I've looked at Russell, I've looked at Arnprior, I have no desire to live in those places. Honestly, they're great cities. I like being in the city. I've lived in Ottawa since about 2010 when I moved here to go to Carleton for university. Or sorry, 2006, doesn't matter. Anyways, and I love the city. I want to stay here, but my wife and I got married in October. We want to have a kid. We're already cramped in our apartment in Barrhaven. We're already pushed to the edge of the city. And we look at where we live and we say, we can't have a kid here. That would be too hard for them. It would be too hard for us. So I'll tell you honestly, like, we've delayed our decision to have a kid, right? And that's hard, right? That's a hard decision that many families are making. Yeah. I have friends who have made that decision to move out of the city. And I can tell you the impact is that there's a few things. It's a climate problem because we have drive until you qualify, right? People commuting an hour for work every day instead of walking 15 minutes to work, right? And that's a huge problem. We have the productivity crisis. It's an emotional crisis. It's an economic crisis. When you spend 2 hours of your day in the car instead of doing productive things, instead of spending time with your family, that puts an enormous strain on you. And I can say that because, I lived in Toronto for a brief period and I commuted 45 minutes on the subway. And I gotta tell you, sitting on the subway in a crowded subway with 200 other people and like standing, holding onto a rail and playing Brick Breaker on my phone, like it was not a good experience, right? And that's sort of like how you get through the commute. And I don't want Ottawa to be like Toronto is now, but 10 years from now, 20 years from now, is Smith Falls the new Hamilton, right? Like how far out are people going to have to go to afford a home? And think about the climate impact of that on our city. Think about the impact on the people who are living here. These are the real consequences if we don't intensify, if we don't build homes where people want to live.
Great. So, and I'll ask if you can keep it brief, Dean, just to respect the day, because I see other people have questions. There's only two solutions in my mind. Either we add on hectares for development, which I don't see the full appetite for, or B, we have to upzone, especially around transit stations. And I know a lot of my colleagues have trouble eating cake and enjoying it too. But is that in your mind the only solution you see is we have to upzone areas, especially around transit nodes, to be able to get more units in place? Just a simple yes or no, and then we can move along.
Yes, I think I vastly prefer intensification over greenfield development, just on climate impact, on the impact of cost to the city. I just think it's a lot easier. I mean, that being said, Ottawa is a very big city, and I'm sure there's opportunity to develop new land as well. I know the official plan recommends a 60-40 split. I don't have strong opinions on that, but there's so much room to intensify. Absolutely.
Terrific. Thank you for your delegation today. It was very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Councillor Cabinet.
Thank you very much, Dean. I feel like I'm listening to my son because he bugs me all the time about the fact that he couldn't buy a house in Ottawa and he's not here anymore. So he moved away. So I totally understand. And it's a feeling of frustration. My question to you is in terms of what we call the missing middle, is that part of what you see as the solution, or is it, do you have to have a single family home? Is that part of it? Because there are different solutions in different cities. I see Montreal as having more missing middle type housing. We don't have very much of it. So there's an expectation that everyone's going to get a single family home, which was fairly easy years ago, but not anymore.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I think the missing middle is the biggest part of the conversation. Absolutely. I would love to live in a neighborhood where, you've got, 2, 3, 4-story apartment buildings. I think of some of the streets I visited in Europe when I've been there in the past, and just like these beautiful old homes, and every home, it's a little bit taller, but 4 to 8 families can live there. And I just think of, that is not density to me. That is just a normal living experience for most people on this planet. So, I understand the appeal of the single family home. Of course, I'd love to have one day. But, if I could find a shared unit with a couple other families that, was a suitable size, 2 large bedrooms or three small bedrooms, I would be so happy with that. And I think that's how most people my age feel. We're not looking for our castle on the hill. We're just looking for a place to live that we can, grow and have a family, and, have the space to work from home in this world, things like that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Teresa. Councillor McKinney.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Dean, for your delegation. I just wanted to circle back around and talk about the demand side. And I know that that's not what you were delegating on. You're looking at supply, but we heard in early February when the census data came out, it did show that housing units in Toronto, in most of the country, actually, outside of the Atlantic provinces, that housing units were actually growing faster than the population. So it would appear that that's not the magic bullet. That there is a demand issue as well in terms of what people are looking for and what developers are developing. And if they're developing, I'll use 50 the driveway because you brought it up. 50 the driveway. Yeah, we had an application to demolish and, sat down with the applicant. But that is an example of a developer that's asking for double the height in an R4 zone for only 88 units. You'll never, or I or anyone, I don't think, looking around, will ever be able to afford a condo at 50 the driveway. And yet, that's what I'm hearing. You're kind of saying to us that should have just been okayed, 8 months ago and not gone through a process of local planning. So just, again, I know this is not about homelessness, but we have people sleeping outside in this city and in a lot of very wealthy cities. Actually, more people sleep outside in more wealthy cities. The population of people sleeping in shelter and outside grows higher in wealthier cities with empty buildings that really are being built for investors and not for families like the one you're describing, your family. So I just wonder if you've given some consideration to that demand side, like what does that really mean in terms of removing the ability for local municipalities to say, yeah, you want double the height, but you want, because it's closest to transit in an R4 zone, and yet you're only building 88 units and you're throwing in a parking spot for each one of those. So I just wonder if you've given that some consideration, and in terms of just what the census data showed early on in February.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. I appreciate your question. So you've touched on a few different things. I'll try and run through quickly because I know I've taken up a lot of time. One, on demand. Yes, there's a lot of demand in Ottawa. We've built an amazing city, and we should all pat ourselves on the back. Everyone who's community minded here, you've built a city that people want to live in, and that's fantastic. And what we're seeing in other parts of the province, Toronto especially, people driven out by their housing crisis are coming here, and now our prices are going up, right? It's not, it's not me having 6 or 7 kids and all my friends doing the same. It's people want to move here from other jurisdictions. So that's great. It's a great problem to have, right? And so when you talk about developers not building the right types of housing, I mean, developers are really easy to understand, in my opinion. They want to build things that they can sell and make money, right? It's not a complicated concept. They are profit driven. So they are going to build the units that they think will sell. So, if they're selling single bedroom condos, there's a demand for it, right? And I understand what you're saying about, people buying them as investment properties and things like that. So a couple of thoughts on that. One, people who do that, they're providing valuable rental stock, which is helpful because we don't have a lot of purpose built rentals coming in the city. Two, I don't think we have, and I think the numbers would back this up, I don't think we have the empty home syndrome that some people make it out to be. Why would someone buy a condo that they could rent for $2,000 a month and leave it empty, right? I just don't think that's happening in great proportions. Three, I think, to go back to specifically the driveway, the reason why it was only 88 units is because it was 3 bedrooms units, right? The type of thing that I would be looking for in a condo, and the type of thing that's really sparing. And then through the planning process, they were told not to do that, and now I believe it's bachelors, 1 beds, and maybe 2 beds. I don't know all the details, so I apologize, but
Certainly weren't told not to build 3 bedrooms. I'll leave
okay,
that.
that's
They
fair,
were,
but
yeah.
through the planning process, they lost that element of it, right?
They chose to do that. They chose to pull back on the 3 bedrooms. We didn't ask for it. We want 3 bedrooms.
That's totally fair. Like I wasn't in those meetings, but I'm just saying the planning process, we lost that, right? I mean, I understand what you're saying, and yes, we don't want vacant homes everywhere. Yes, I would love to see more 3-bedroom homes and condos built than 1-bedroom condos, but if the market is what the market is, and developers are going to build things that sell, and ultimately we solve this by building enough housing. If we build enough housing, it no longer becomes a good investment to buy a 1-bedroom condo that you can't rent, right? That no longer is an investment that people make. If we build enough housing, that problem goes away.
Thank you. I'll just say this. It would seem from the census data, and it's just data, it's not my opinion, that we have been building enough housing. It is not only the supply, and we want supply as we grow. There's absolutely no doubt about it, but it is not targeted to what's required. So I'll leave it at that. I appreciate the conversation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor.
Thanks, Catherine. Councillor Eglai.
Yeah, I'll keep this very brief. Dean, very interesting your presentation. And I guess what it raised for me, you talked about Montreal, for example, where someone talked about Montreal and having homes, I think it was Councillor Kavanaugh, perhaps, in the mushy middle, or the missing middle. I grew up in Montreal, and full disclosure, I lived in some of those missing middle type units growing up, where it wasn't uncommon to have a fourplex or a low-rise apartment building on a street mixed in with residential homes. So I guess my question to you is, we've talked a lot as a result of your presentation about home ownership as opposed to providing housing. So I guess my question to you is part of the answer society, Ottawa community sort of pivoting and saying, it's not a bad thing to live in a rental if you could get a 2 or 3 bedroom rental unit, that the goal is to have an appropriate roof and space over your head, as opposed to necessarily having ownership. So is part of it this view that somehow renting is less advantageous, is less desirable than owning? Is that part of the problem? And is that another way to kind of address the situation by promoting more rental accommodations, for example, but of size? And I'll give you an example. There's a building going up in my area, or hopes to go up in my area, and it's going to be apartment. And one of the things that the community raised in the community meeting is they wanted to see 2 and 3 bedroom units in that building, and not just bachelors and what have you. They wanted to see families move into that community, and if the way they could move in was by renting, that was okay. So I guess my question to you is, should we also be talking about not only the size of the housing, but the type, and sort of moving away from somehow renting is less desirable than owning?
Great. So that's a great question. I mean, I rent. I'm very happy with where I rent. It's a little small if I want to grow my family. That's the biggest obstacle I face. And we've looked at renting bigger houses. And I can tell you, in Barrhaven, we can find like a nice 3-bedroom home, like a detached home for rental for between $2,200 and $2,500 a month, which is not unreasonable for the income I make. The challenge there is, if you look at it through an equity lens, I've doubled my paycheck in the past 5 years through growing my business and progressing through my career. But my friends who bought a house 5 years ago, and have not had the same career growth and are in the same place in their career as they were 5 years ago, their net worth grew substantially more than mine did, right? And they've built all this equity, and their equity, if they ever choose to sell, has doubled in value from what they've put in. there is a growing divide between those who own a home and those who don't. And it's growing farther and faster. And so you have and have nots in society, right? So really, for me, it's not about like the quality of life of where I live right now. It's about my financial place in the world and having enough money to retire one day, and having something to pass on to my kids, right? And I think anyone who bought 5 years ago looks like a genius, and the rest of us are left wondering, like, is there something wrong with us because we didn't buy 5 years ago? Like, are we just stupid? And no, we're not just stupid, but the market has grown at a much faster rate than anyone anticipated. I mean, someone chatted earlier about the boom in the 90s. I went back and looked at the numbers. The jump in the 90s was 5 to 10% year over year. Last year we were almost at 40% January to January. The year before was close to 20% in terms of house prices. Like, it's accelerating at a rapid pace, and that the have-nots are just falling further and further behind. I hope that answers your question.
It helps. I guess the point I was going to make is that I still hear a little bit, and I don't know if it's intentional, I still hear a little bit of a pejorative between owning a home and then you're a have, and renting a home and then you're a have-not. So I'll just leave it at that. I mean, in your case, you've doubled your income because you've doubled your capacity to do business. So that in itself is a financial benefit that you've created. But I'm still hearing a little bit, and again, I'm not saying it's intentional, Dean, but I'm hearing a little bit that it still is a better thing to own a home than it is to find a place that you can raise your family that you're renting in. And I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I just to say that is not a societal thing. That's a financial
We've got
thing.
a lot of speakers. Keith that doesn't have a question, so thank you, Keith. Matt,
Okay,
Councillor Fleury has another question for you.
Yeah, thank you. And I was exactly where Keith was. Dina, I want to understand the assumption that, from my perspective, too many have that home ownership is the best thing since sliced bread. Where are the economics of that? Because I remember between the Harper government and the Trudeau government, there was a big CMHC report that really spoke of over a 30-year period, if you owned your home, and the equity that you could extract of that versus if you actually put the same saving and invested it appropriately. And the end was really, really similar. So I think I'd like to understand how our attention to home ownership is not based on an investment and is only, because I think so many are focused on the investment, the equity side of it, rather than, okay, who cares? I live in a home. I care about the quality of the home and the amount I'm paying every month. And if I'm financially sound and I can put that money aside and make other investments, then what's wrong with renting? So I'm on Keith's bandwagon here, and I want to understand from your perspective, why is home ownership so dominant? Because it creates such a challenge. And the Montreal example still applies today. Out of large Canadian cities, there's still at 60+% of folks who are in Montreal rent. I don't see any big societal problems in Montreal compared to us.
Yeah, so I'll be brief. I agree completely with you and Councillor Eagley. I love renting. I'm happy to be a renter, but I didn't see 40% returns on my stock portfolio last year, right? I didn't see 20% the year before. I haven't seen 100% returns over the past 5 years. I wish I did. Maybe I got the wrong stock guy, but the housing market is just accelerating so much faster than everything else. And I think what you're saying was true, in around 2015, because at that time, house prices has grown like 1 to 2% for the past 5 or 6 years. That has not been the case for the past 5 years. It has accelerated at a rapid pace. And yeah, I am not saying this in a pejorative way towards renters. I'm here advocating on behalf of renters because I think a lot of them want something more eventually in life, right? And I think the struggle is that people who own homes are getting ahead so much faster than people who don't, regardless of the quality of accommodations. You know, if you own a 50-year-old condo or a 40-year-old condo like the one I bid on, and you paid $200 for it 5 years ago, and now it sells for $575, well, you're doing pretty well for yourself, right?
Yeah, just a final comment, because you made reference to stock, and there is a local built stock in Shopify that actually made that much more than that percentage point over the 2015 period. So good investors find ways to make money. I guess my final point is a lot of people are homeowners, but they treat their home ownership as a rental. And I think you know what I mean. They pay the very, very least they can on the mortgage and hope that the property value goes up. That only works at a small interest rates and the continued growth that we're seeing in a house value. That shifts very quickly if you move 1-2 percent points for many of those individuals. We could probably talk all day, and I know the chair has reminded us there's a lot of speakers. Thank you.
Okay, I'm seeing no more questions. Thanks, Mathieu, and thank you, Dean. Good questions, good conversation, and that's right, Councillor Fleury. Between all the items today, we have about 30 speakers, and we've just finished speaker number 1. So please keep that in mind as we go. Our next public speaker is John Dance. Good morning, John.
Appreciate the opportunity. I'm the chair of the Old Ottawa East Community Association Planning Committee, and I appreciate the opportunity you're giving to speak to this profound changes that potentially will come from the province. If I may see the presentation, the first slide, the next slide, please. So it does appear to some of us, not the previous speaker, that the removal of constraints to building residences, I mean, that recommendation will remove these constraints and they'll offload infrastructure costs to taxpayers, and it will maximize profits, increase profits of developers. And that may be fine for developers, but there's a whole lot of other issues to consider. There are gross deficiencies with this report. We already heard that it ignores intentionally the fundamental issue of affordable housing for lower income people. Yeah, why didn't they spend the time on this critical issue rather than the broader issue of the planning process? The report fails to consider environmental impacts. It doesn't speak of tree canopy, it doesn't speak of climate change. These are fundamentally important to our society, not just the affordability of a house. It dismisses communities, neighbors, neighborhood character and the fabric, discounts the value of heritage, diminishes municipal powers, and curtails community influence. We can go to the next slide, please. It's premised on the belief, the fantasy that developers know best and that laissez-faire development yields the best outcomes. It seems to think that challenges to developers' proposals are NIMBYism, that municipalities aren't capable, that they simply impede, that the neighborhood fabric compatible development isn't important, that heritage, environmental, and social concerns hinder building. And they have no benefits, heritage, environmental, and social concerns in themselves. If I can go to the next slide, please. One key example in the massive recommendations, the one pertaining to appeals. Anybody who's involved with community associations, they know that the deck is already stacked against them. We lack the resources, we lack the expertise. For the previous government, had the Lpat, not OLT at the time, Lpat was actually going to provide support to communities. Then the Ford government eliminated that. Developers, they donate to councillors, they hire former city staff. It's a hopelessly slanted, biased situation we already have. The developer's fantasy, as per these recommendations, are that they'd increase the appeal fee to OLT, the new OMB, from $400 to $10,000, would limit the right of appeal and reward costs to the developer. Our community association has been able to appeal recent decisions, but we would not have been able to had the cost gone up to $10,000 just to make the appeal, to submit it. Our issues have addressed environmental, heritage, community character, and community functioning. And these are really, really important. It's not just a matter of affordability in terms of a development. The developer's dismissal of community association concerns is simply NIMBYism, is their way of putting profit ahead of community well-being. There are a lot of factors to consider, and these recommendations of the Housing Task Force, Affordable Housing Task Force, do not consider these other equally, or perhaps more important factors. If I may move to the next slide, please. So let me just speak to our experience in Old Ottawa East and what we've seen happen over the last 15 years or so. We've changed a lot, and we will continue to change as a result of incremental and collaborative planning process. You know, we worked really hard with the city, with the institutional landowners for a community design plan and the subsequent secondary plan. Consequence, we have a livable community with a lot of intensification. Our heritage designations, you know, thanks to the city and others, we've got them implemented and they've been reasonably respected. There have been differences of opinion, but hey, we've got them there and it's really important to maintain. The streetscape character analysis, mature neighborhood overlay provisions, they you know, these help in terms of zoning to ensure that there is compatible development. You know, secondary or second units, they're permitted now. It does promote appropriate intensification. The you know, the LRT with the transit-oriented development is key. I mean, just through Lee's Station, there'll be another, it will take time, but another 3,700 dwelling units built there. The new official plan, it too is providing a lot more. We simply do not need what the province is trying to force onto the system. Collaborative planning, it means better outcomes. Provincial fiat does not. If I may move to the last slide, please. So the recommendations to staff, they're basically sound, they're good. But we suggest that you need to push back on the task force's premises and its deficiencies. You need to ensure that municipal control is not diminished. And frankly, it's important to encourage citizens and their community associations to be a key part of the development process. Local democracy is essential. Developer dominance is detrimental. We do have the question, what are we really doing about affordable housing for lower income people? I'll leave it at that. I just hope that you really push back on this, because the city we have depends on all of us working together. It's not a matter of developers getting to do whatever the heck they want, regardless of the community and environmental costs. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
Thank you, John. Councillor Brockington has a question for you.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you for your presentation and your submission in advance, which I read. I think it's quite solid. The previous delegate accused councillors of playing politics. If we had the audacity to actually represent our constituents and our neighborhoods when certain development files come to life, and you in your presentation talked about compatible development and respecting the community fabric when certain developments are proposed. Can you specifically talk to that and expand on why that's so important for your community and other communities?
Certainly. In terms of the compatibility, we, and I think other people in the city like it when you can have trees, for instance, on your street so that you have a shaded environment where there is enough parkland for people to enjoy themselves, where there's some respect for the new building going up. There's respect for the neighbors of it. It's a matter of having development that is compatible rather than making it miserable for the people all around. We can have this when it's sensible, when it's worked out, when developers in the city and the residents and the community associations sit down together. But if it's just done, you will have incompatibility when it's just forced on residences.
I appreciate your presentation. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Councillor Menard.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thanks for being here, John. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. The first is a real world practical question. There's been a lot of development in Old Ottawa East recently, a lot of infill happening. Large swaths of green space have been turned over to housing, and in some cases it makes a lot of sense where it is. But I wanted to ask you about, how many new units are being created in Old Ottawa East, just percentage wise. I mean, is it a 10% increase in the last several years going forward? Is it 20%? I mean, I think you're very involved, obviously, in Greystone development. Otherwise, what's your sense of how many new units are being created for the community right now?
Thank you, Councillor, through the chair. Yes, Greystone Village will produce another 1,000 units. The various other developments on Main Street will produce another 1,000. The Lees-oriented, or the transit-oriented development at Lee Station will produce another 3,700. Hawthorne and the St. Paul University development, that's possibly another 500. I mean, so to get to the point, we've already gone up by about 20% over the last 5 years. Over the next 10 to 15, we'll probably go up by another 2,000 or 3,000. The transit-oriented development at Lee Station will take longer for sure, but we're going to double our population within 10 years. We'll probably double it again in another 10 years. So I think that's, you want that intensification to happen in consultation with the community. I think it's really good that we have LRT, that we have transit-oriented development, that we're using these institutional lands for other purposes. We're doing sensible infill, but there are limits. It shouldn't just be whatever developers want to put up. Councillor, thank you.
Yeah, very good point. And on that point, John, how much while we've had this intensive growth in Old Ottawa East during this time, how much have prices increased over the last 5 years in your neighborhoods?
Well, they clearly have gone up, and probably comparable to what they've gone up in other areas of central Ottawa. They probably have, but I wouldn't like to make the distinction, and this sort of gets to the heart of the matter. I don't really think, I looked at this, that Houston, without any zoning, they've gone up enormously in Houston and some other no zoning American cities. And so I'm not quite convinced that taking constraints off developers is a means of lowering costs. The drivers for the increased costs are a whole bunch. They're not just that developers haven't got to do whatever the heck they want to do. Just make that point.
Well, I think it's important, and Chair, I'll wrap up here quickly. I know we got a long day, but the point being that we've had drastic increases, almost a doubling of units in Old Ottawa East and going forward, with a large increase in price during that time as well. So the more supply that's being created, drastic more supply isn't creating more affordability. Those demand factors and supply factors certainly have an effect beyond just what we're talking about in terms of municipal zoning. And my last question to you is around the report itself. You read through the provincial task force report. What strikes me is how blatantly this is tied to developer profit. I look at point 17 in the city's feedback around requiring municipalities to compensate property owners for loss of property values as a result of heritage designations based on the principle of best economic land use, or requiring a $10,000 filing fee for Lpat, or waiving development charges in parkland cash in lieu and charge only modest connection fees for infill residential projects up to 10 units, or for any development where there's no new material infrastructure will be required. I question this because it seems like this is very focused on providing developers a lot more leeway and financial benefits and windfalls. I wonder your thoughts on that.
Well, I can't say anything beyond what you've just said. It's quite true. It's you need a balanced system. I think the City of Ottawa has worked pretty hard to have it balanced, to have the 3 or 4 parties work together. to have rules, to have discussion. It does take more time, but you get a whole lot better process. And it's not to say improvements can't be made, and you've been making improvements, and the more improvements will be made. But it should not be dictated by the province, and developers should not have the dominant hand. That's my point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Seeing no more questions, I just wanted, there was a line in your slide, John, that stood out for me, which was collaborative planning equals better outcomes. Provincial fiat does not. And I think that's worth keeping in mind that if we want to move people from not in my backyard to yes in my backyard, we do have to be considering the local considerations as well as the provincial considerations as they relate to a housing crisis. So thank you, John, for your presentation. The next speaker is Patrick Sylvain.
Hello, council members, Mr. Chair, and delegations. Today, I'd like to urge the council members to reject the city's response to the Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force recommendations. Instead, I urge the council members to support the Ontario recommendations. So I'm a new engineer and I'm looking for my next apartment. I'm considering being a long-term rental. And I'm often considering moving out of the city where I grew up because of the surging rental costs. I should highlight, based on the discussions that I heard, that rental prices follow home ownership prices because those costs get passed down to the renter. But recently, many people like myself are discovering that it's North American exclusionary zoning practices that are the root cause of this crisis. There's a clear trend in the media making this point clear. So Dean Tester's social media presence are part of this trend. And you might know other American YouTube channels like Climate Town and Not Just Bikes, which get tens of millions of views off of this point. More than half of our residential land based on our land use map is supporting nothing other than single family zoning homes. And this severely restricts our housing supplies and is driving up the cost. So Ottawa's response, I've noticed, refers a lot to the new official plan that I read through. And I found that plan to be too ambiguous. So when I look at the Ontario recommendations, they're very clear about densification. They promote that in all residential areas, we should allow as of right zoning for up to 4 units and 4 stories. On the other hand, the Ottawa's city official plan uses loose qualitative wording like allowing 3 or more units per lot on appropriate locations, which can really mean anything. So the city should really accept the Ontario recommendations. And I'd like to highlight that cities in the US, like Minneapolis and the state of California, have already moved to end single family zoning only, like what was recommended in Ontario's report. We should also be leaders in housing affordability. There was a comment about the home vacancies. And in the census, I did look at this last night again, 9% of homes are vacant in Canada, but that doesn't consider for homes that are temporary homes for students, for example, or homes that are on the market for sale or for rent. So today I am urging you to support the Housing Affordability Task Force recommendations and reject the draft City of Ottawa report. We're in a crisis and we need to put affordability first. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. I'll look to the committee for any questions they may have for you. Councillor Moffat.
Just a quick one. You believe that we should accept the entire slate of recommendations from the province. We've had bills in the past, Bill 68, Bill 73 under the previous government, which were written as though they didn't actually know how municipalities work. Because the province doesn't always know what's best for municipalities. So in the case of recommendation 17, which speaks to heritage buildings, it values the economic land use higher than the heritage value of the property. And that if we designate a property heritage, which we do, I've been on the Built Heritage Subcommittee since 2012, that we would then have to pay the owner of the heritage property the balance of whatever they would have lost with the impact of the heritage designation. Do you believe that taxpayers should be on the hook for paying private property owners who own heritage properties because we maybe prevented their ability to resell at the price that they wanted to resell at?
Thank you for your question, Councillor. Regarding this, my stance on the Ontario housing affordability recommendations is to support the densification recommendations they've outlined. Regarding these, this note that you make, I'm not familiar enough in the matter to comment.
That's kind of the point though, right? Is that you have 55 recommendations. There are a lot of the recommendations that are perfectly fine. And I agree with you on exclusionary zoning, but not all the recommendations are perfectly sound and do require more effort and more work on behalf of the municipalities in order to refine those recommendations and make them more suitable to municipalities across Ontario. So just blindly supporting all these doesn't make sense. So asking council to completely reject what we have in front of us, I think flies in the face of what our role is as a municipality. Thank you.
I want to follow up on that with the question. So there are a lot of recommendations that limit the local planning role or residents' role in engagement and consultation on planning issues. Should local residents, neighborhood associations, what role should they have in the planning process? Patrick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, I'm here before you, taking time out of my day to participate in this process that we're having now. So what I'm looking to show is that there are Yes in My Backyard members in Ottawa, and there are many who are looking for overall densification as part of the city. And the point I made is that the Ontario plan has a very concisely worded approach to this, and that is an aspect that we should consider implementing in our policies.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. We're going to move on to our next speaker, Linda Hode. Good morning, Linda. Oh, you're on mute, Linda.
I think I've got it.
You do.
Thank you. I am presenting on behalf of Heritage Ottawa. And of course, I will be talking about the heritage recommendations in the report. Heritage Ottawa is actually was very concerned about this report. We feel that it is a blatant grab for power, taking power away from the municipality and handing it over to the developers with the helping hand of the province. There are many recommendations, and some of the councillors have referred to them, where this is simply not appropriate. However, I will be concentrating on heritage. We were very upset because it was portrayed as an impediment to realizing the true economic value of a property, as Councillor Moffat pointed out, as though economic value is the only value, ignoring the cultural value, social value, and environmental value of heritage properties. We noted a deep lack of understanding, even hostility in this report about the purpose and impact of heritage designation. Some of these recommendations would appear to require amendments to the Ontario Heritage Act, not to mention the provincial policy statement. So how the province is going to handle that will be an interesting question should they proceed. I would like to comment just briefly on Heritage Ottawa's involvement or understanding of some of the recommendations. For example, 12A, to repeal or override municipal policies, zoning, or plans that prioritize the preservation of physical character of neighborhoods. As some of you may know, the heritage conservation districts, which seem to be targeted in some sense in this recommendation, they have all or almost all got guideline documents. And the guideline documents recognize cultural heritage value and attributes of the areas, but provide guidelines for alterations and new construction in the area. With respect to recommendation 16, prevent abuse of heritage preservation and designation process by prohibiting the use of bulk listing on municipal heritage registers and prohibiting reactive heritage designations after a Planning Act development application has been submitted. It's been our experience over many years now that the lack of a publicly accessible heritage register led to frequent misunderstandings about the potential heritage significance of a property acquired for redevelopment, leading to the perception that a proposed heritage designation was reactive. Heritage Ottawa actively lobbied the city for the creation of an accessible heritage register in order to remedy this situation. And we do agree with the staff that the robust heritage registers creates more certainty for property owners and limits the number of reactive designations undertaken. Recommendation 17, requiring municipalities to compensate property owners for loss of property values. We feel the staff has effectively countered this false information that designation results in loss of property value with some of the research that they cited in the report. Heritage Ottawa also has some experience in this area. We participated along with heritage conservation districts in the city in 2 research studies of the Ontario heritage conservation districts, not just Ottawa, but all of Ontario, led by the Heritage Resources Centre at the University of Waterloo. And their reports were entitled Heritage Districts Work. Their research included interviews with owners, with municipal staff, sales history trends from Geo Warehouse, and statistics on requests for alterations. The key findings included satisfaction with living and owning property in districts is overwhelming. Real estate values in heritage conservation districts generally rise more consistently than surrounding areas. So we feel that these recommendations should certainly, the city's recommendations should be supported with respect to these heritage issues. Heritage Ottawa has been working for over 50 years to champion the protection and stewardship of Ottawa's built heritage and cultural places, celebrating their value and enriching our shared environment. We have long recognized economic, social, and environmental benefits of heritage conservation. And again, we urge you to support the city staff's recommendations with respect to these particular provincial statements. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Linda. Councillor King has a question.
Thank you, Co-Chair, and I just really wanted to thank Linda for her comments and for the submission by Heritage Ottawa. I have to agree, after reviewing both the report and the response by the city, it is clear that there are major inconsistencies which you outlined, especially around values of properties in heritage conservation districts. And I also appreciate the fact that staff is pointing out that there is a huge amount of ambiguity coming out of the report from the province, especially concerning whether the recommendations that have been put in place would actually repeal or override heritage conservation district plans. So it creates a huge amount of ambiguity, and the way that these plans do work, as we know, as councillors, and also there are definitely a few members around the table here of Heritage Subcommittee, we know that these documents don't prioritize neighborhood character over new housing and are typically aligned with existing plans. And that these plans do contemplate growth and change in heritage conservation districts through additions, new construction, infill, but are not concerned with the use or number of units. So, the system that we have in place aims to accommodate growth while at the same time looking at all of those areas that we value that go beyond just monetary value. With properties, which I think was lacking in this report. And I'm happy that you brought that out. the cultural value, the heritage value, social value. Those values are as important, if not more, than economic values in certain contexts. So I do just appreciate the fact that you brought this to the fore, and I appreciated the comments brought by Heritage Ottawa. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Councillor. Linda, I want to ask you directly, the page 12 of the report from Ontario says that heritage preservation has become a tool to block more housing. In your many years of experience in Ottawa, have you seen heritage being used as a tool to block housing?
I don't think so. The driveway, of course, is the poster child at the moment, because in that instance, the building was not designated, was not on the heritage register, and the proposal to demolish the building, which was, I think, has been recognized by people who are in the know, is a very significant modernist building built by a very prominent Ottawa architect. So it posed quite a difficult issue. It could have been, I think, if it had been designated, I think there could have been a solution where you would be able to add additional units while preserving most or all of the existing building. I mean, there was an addition. And I'm thinking of 70 Nicholas Street is about to come, well, it's in the process of being worked. That's the old registry office, which is sort of overwhelmed by the blank wall of the Rideau Center. There is a proposal, very interesting proposal, to add, to sort of fill in basically the tiny little green space that's left there with apartments, and to incorporate the heritage building in the new development in a very sensitive way, which looks as though it could be quite successful. So there are examples, many of them, I think, where existing buildings, heritage designated buildings, are used as a foundation, if you like, for a new development. And in many cases, I mean, some of the bigger, older homes, many of them are occupied by embassies, which doesn't contribute to housing. But a big old, well, as I think the first speaker said, the McMansions, we can turn them into 4 or 5 units and preserve the heritage. The heritage outside. Most heritage buildings don't have interior designations. It's the outside. What you see from the street is what's most important. And so, yeah, I think there is a misperception that, oh my goodness, nothing can change, it's heritage. But that's not true. As Councillor King has pointed out, all kinds of changes are being made to buildings and districts in order to provide more housing or other activities, and but preserve the character and the important aspects of the heritage buildings.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm seeing no more questions, so thank you, Linda, for your presentation today.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Laura Irichega from the Old Ottawa South Community Association. Good morning, Laura.
Good morning. Trying to find myself here. How are you? On behalf of the Old Ottawa South Community Association, I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time to listen to our comments on the Ontario at Market Rate Housing Supply Task Force report. This would be, we consider, a more accurate title for a report that bills itself as addressing affordable housing on the cover, but then explains that affordable housing isn't part of its mandate. OSCA doesn't have the expertise to begin to solve the complex problem of affordable housing, but we do know where answers don't lie. Answers are not to be found in recommendations to reduce community involvement to the legal minimum, or to reduce the power of municipal councils, or to adopt a one-size-fits-all approach for municipalities all across Ontario. Ottawa is a city with a strong, the values which define that culture are evident as you look all around our city. We value diversity and are unique. Just as Old Ottawa South isn't downtown, Ottawa isn't Toronto. Blanket recommendations, which would apply to all towns and all cities without regard for municipal context, not to mention community context, undermine all communities and all municipalities. Recommendations to limit community meetings are actually at cross purposes with the report's stated goal of speeding up the development process. Public input, if it's sought early in the design stages, can help to identify and resolve issues. However, this can only occur when the process is truly collaborative and not just another box ticking exercise. Meeting common objectives for increasing affordable housing requires more, not less, collaboration. The authors of the report reveal their bias when identifying normal processes as suffering from quote unquote abusive process. Recommendation 16, as spoken to by Linda Hode, speaks to the abuse of the heritage preservation and designation process. There is indeed a process, but there's no such abuse. The percentage of properties or areas designating as having heritage value is a small component of the available properties in Ottawa and throughout Ontario. Our stock of heritage buildings is limited. Heritage requires more, not less, protection. Interestingly, although the OLT process now is singled out as needing to be curtailed when the appellants are third parties, community groups, and residents, the authors recommend elsewhere that a developer's right of appeal of official plans be restored. This again reveals a bias, as it will not lead to greater housing affordability, but it will add time delays, clog the OLT, and divert municipal resources that could otherwise be spent on application reviews. A recommendation to waive development charges and parkland cash in lieu for residential infill up to 10 units will ultimately not benefit residents in multi-unit buildings who have a greater need of parks than residents who have access to private green spaces. Another recommendation proposing to circumscribe the power of councillors by removing their ability to withdraw delegation of authority is also a clear overreach. Further reducing site plan control provisions, exempting some projects from site plan control and public consultation, allowing as of right zoning with unlimited height and densities around transit stations, zoning from 6 to 11 stories on any street that it has public transit, overriding municipal policies, and zoning throughout all of Ontario are all objectionable. What would help increase more affordable market rate housing? Form-based zoning, appropriate intensification, appropriate densification, laneway homes, secondary suites. These are some solutions that Ottawa is already employing. How can industry help? Well, it can start by improving efficiencies through prefabrication, modularity, and other new technologies, and by collaborating with municipalities and with residents. Back to the report. A number of these recommendations, if accepted, will curtail community engagement and undermine municipal authority. And there is no guarantee in there anywhere. The development cost savings will be passed on to consumers and result in greater housing affordability. OSCA supports in principle the response of the City of Ottawa. And we'd also like to thank the FCA, which has been a great leader on this file for all community associations. Thank you to you, councillors, and thank you to staff for all of your hard work. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Councillor Menard has a question for you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Laura, and to yourself and Richard, President of OSCA, for your excellent detailed submission. I hope that that also gets forwarded on to the Ontario authorities as well. It's important that they see it as this is likely coming forward soon at that level. I wanted to ask you about the Lpat fees. You write that recommendation 27 refers to preventing abuse of process by increasing Lpat application fees from $400 to $10,000 for third parties, which would include neighbors and community groups. And you say there is no abuse of process. So I'd like if you could expand on that point and why it's important for neighborhood groups to have that lower threshold when for appeal rights.
Well, the purpose of the Lpat OLT, tribunal, whatever we want to call it, the flavor of the year, its purpose is actually to hear appeals. So curtailing the appeal process because there's a perceived, abusive process there is no abusive process. The process exists for that reason, so that people can go when they disagree with the decision. I mean, that's what a democracy is. So if you close it off so that it's only available, it becomes like a gated community, and only people who can afford to apply get heard, or have their grievances aired, or have the chance to have someone who is presumably independent decide whether a case has merit. That goes against the entire flow of what a democracy is. If first you reduce people's ability to have collaborative consultation, and then you reduce their right to participate, and then finally you reduce their right to comment, which hasn't happened obviously here. We all comment, we all still participate, but you can see where it goes. Things have, everybody's, the developers, the different levels of government, try to define everything as a top-down process, whereas it can't be. If we are all to live together, and if we are all to live in a democratic society, it's the opposite. It has to start from the ground up. So these processes exist so that these things can happen.
Thank you very much.
Something only for rich people, then hello.
I appreciate your comments. I did see city staff's comment around this, that they did make a minor comment that the city is concerned that it is overly prohibitive for smaller stakeholder groups. I think we need to be a bit more expansive on that and explain further what the concerns are. I very much appreciate staff's comments throughout the report. I think there are some areas that we could probably improve before council. This is one of them that I'll be addressing. So I appreciate your comments here.
I think, one thing that really bothers me there is that, there's a recommendation to raise fees for community groups and to make them prove ahead of time that a case has merit before it's ever heard, whereas the process is there to determine whether there is merit or not. And then at the same time saying, we the developers want to restore our right to appeal official plan. So, there's something there that doesn't work. It's one or the other. And, frankly, I don't think one should be limiting community groups at all.
Absolutely. Yeah, fair point. Thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Councilor Menard. Thank you, Laura, for your presentation today. We have 4 more speakers: Patrick Morton, Alex Cullen, Tony Miller, and Alan Cliff. So we'll go to Patrick Morton next. Good morning, Patrick.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair. So I'm Patrick. I'm just here on behalf of myself as a member of the public. My opinions are my own. So just a little bit more about myself. I just turned 30, just recently got engaged, starting to look at planning out my family. And the key thing here is, of course, that I'm renting currently. I am saving to buy a house, although in the last little while, I usually tell that last part as a joke, a bit of a dark joke. So yeah, I'm cards on the table. I'm going to be in favor of improving housing affordability, improving densification. But I do share a lot of the concerns that I've seen with with Ontario's report. I think a lot of the concerns are good ones, especially where the report doesn't even consider below market housing. It's not referencing climate change. And of course I mentioned that a lot of this is taking away powers from the municipality. I appreciate local government, and I appreciate that you'd want to preserve those abilities of the municipality to regulate its own affairs. But I really want to see Ottawa take a more of a leadership role on this file. I really want to see Ottawa being the government that acknowledges, yes, there's a problem here. There's a housing crisis. We have the tools to address it, at least part of it. Municipalities have a huge impact on how we build housing, how a lot of our lives are shaped by decisions made at this level. And I wish that Ottawa would take that leadership role here. And in some of the responses to the recommendations, I'm not seeing that role. I'm going to take a few examples of what I feel are some of the most key recommendations. And of course, this isn't legislation yet, so we don't really know some of these details. And I appreciate the need to flesh those out in a conversation with the province. But in a few examples here, I'll start with the limits on exclusionary zoning. And in fact, in the presentation earlier from staff, they mentioned that they're in fact in favor of recommendation number 3, which is to limit exclusionary zoning. But that is, I don't really see that Ottawa is taking the lead there. We're not eliminating exclusionary zoning across the city. We still have low density zoning covering much of the city. The official plan isn't really going to change that. The province is recommending we allow as of right housing up to 4 stories on a single residential lot. We're not doing that. And that would go a huge way, I think, into allowing smaller, more incremental development in residential areas where that's not currently feasible to go beyond the single detached home. Further, I'll go to recommendation 12, and not the heritage portion, but rather 12C, which is about the permissive planning and the zoning standards. So the pushback here from the city is that this doesn't allow for some of context-specific rules on zoning, things like tree cover, and well, it's we're not quite sure what the specifics of this would be in actual legislation. This is clearly referring to standards such as maximum setbacks, minimum heights, shadows, front doors, things like that, which I think are actually a bit underappreciated as something that adds cost to development. It really limits the options, even in something like a 6-story house has to become a 4-story house because of the shadow angle. I think, and I agree again that we don't really want the province to be imposing this, but I think Ottawa should be leading and saying, yes, we hear that this is an issue and we're adjusting our standards to reflect better practices. And the same again, we've heard a lot about the issue with public consultation. I think we need to acknowledge that it can be quite burdensome and it can really only have impacts for a certain segment of the population. People like me and people I hope to sort of kind of represent here, people less fortunate who aren't able to access even the sort of more comfortable rental that I have, they're not at those meetings. You're not hearing those voices. So yeah, short, I think this is more intransigent than leadership, but I really hope that Ottawa can take more steps, perhaps if the conversation leads back to the official plan, if the province rejects it, if we come back and take in some of these into consideration, then the province won't have to mandate that. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. There's a couple questions for you. First, Councillor Leeper.
Thank you very much, Chair. Patrick, thank you very much for the presentation. The question I have is with respect to trying to address the housing crisis, both through urban expansion as well as intensification. All of our R4 neighborhoods, we've doubled the intensity that's allowed. We're going to, against all logic, if I may be political, allow an entirely new subdivision of thousands of units at the Taywin lands. The official plan has laid the groundwork for a comprehensive zoning bylaw review in which multiple areas of the city are probably going to lose the exclusionary zoning. The R1 will be eliminated in many places through that exercise. The significant increases in intensification allowed in the R3 will probably move right across the urban area. Why is this not enough to meet the housing demand?
So first of all, I'd say obviously that process isn't complete with the zoning review. Maybe I'm a bit more pessimistic that we'll see that widespread elimination of R1. I think R1 is the most critical here as it covers the most land area by far in Ottawa. So I guess part of that's just pessimism. Of course, the timing's a bit off. If Ottawa could come back to the province and say, look, we've done our zoning review, we've eliminated R1 in most, if not all, areas of the city, I think that would be sufficient. So yeah.
So the door is open to that without having something imposed on council. And I think the notion on the part of planning staff in responding to the province's task force is that we we should make those decisions in a locally sensitive context. But the door's not closed. I was just wondering whether you had different math than staff have in terms of satisfying housing demand with the moves that council has already made and will be making in the next term.
Well, I can't really speak to what we will be doing. My concern here was just that I want the city to be able to come back and specifically have that process done, to be able to speak, to say, this is how we're going to address this. No need to impose it. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Fleury.
Thank you, Chair, and I'll be quick as well. Thank you, Councillor Leeper, for the questions. Patrick, that's where I was going to raise points. I guess I'll build on to the conversation you just had, just to get clarification. So you're of the mindset that the provincial government should just remove R1s with across the province with specific local specificity, say Heritage Conservation District or individually designated homes. Is that fair to state?
If the province were to remove R1, yeah, I would be in favor of that. But I really do appreciate the need to keep those autonomous powers within the city of Ottawa. So if the city of Ottawa were to put in a plan that's maybe a bit more conservative, I think that'll go a long way to meeting the need as well.
A bit less conservative, I guess, in this environment.
Or conservative. If Ottawa were to say, look, we eliminated 70% of our R1, I think that would be quite sufficient. And then you don't.
Okay, no, I wanted to clarify that. So I too love city independence, but we need clear guidelines of what our authorities are. So I think Councillor Leeper's point around next term of council would be reviewing the zoning bylaw, which will present the full change of the R, well, let's call it the R regime. I wanted to raise a point that I don't want you raised specifically on a site plan. You didn't present it that way, but to me it was that way, and I want to present it because I do have a motion later. Site plan reviews aren't colors of a front door. Site plan reviews in R4 environments are much more complex, and if they're not well done with community inputs and councillors, there are costs to the city relating to calls to 311 or even relating to utilities. So I want to give you that space. Is what is the issue from your perspective to site plan other than concerns to delays? Because I respect we have to do a better job relating to timelines, no question, but I want to fully understand what you're saying around site plan concerns.
I think you're talking about the province-wide zoning standards, which was in 12C. For site plans. So I recognize, of course, more than just colors of front doors. But I think what the province is saying here is that some of those standards could be maybe a bit excessive. Things like, shadow rules, minimum heights, minimum or maximum setbacks. So the province is recommending reducing or eliminating some of those standards. If the city were to come back and say we're recommending reducing these ourselves, I think that would be ideal, because those can really impose costs. Those can really change what a developer can do to add to a building, to build a new building. They have to cut down what was supposed to be 6 stories to 4 because of a small change in shadow.
Patrick, I'm sorry, maybe I misunderstood. Yeah, I caught really on the front door comment, less so on the various provisions. So I don't have further questions, Mr. Chair. Thank you for delegation, Patrick, and it's great to see young professionals come to committee and talking about urban planning and the future of our city. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm seeing no more questions, so thanks very much, Patrick, for joining us today. Next speaker is Alex Cullen, representing the Federation of Citizens Associations. Good morning, Alex.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Federation of Citizens Associations and its 74 members are often involved in planning matters as it affects neighborhoods our residents live in and the taxes they pay. These are not trivial matters. Planning decisions have quality of life implications for our residents, as well as practical issues such as parking, parkland, municipal services, and taxes. By and large, we support the overall thrust of the city's response, as we believe it reflects our mutual concerns. But we have our own concerns. The task force proposes development as of right in residential housing of up to 4 units and 4 stories on a single residential lot and multi-tenant housing province-wide. Such open-ended language ignores the need to balance development with appropriate infrastructure, including not only hard services, but green space, tree canopy, access to services. The object should be to build communities, not just houses. The provincial approach of one size fits all does not. Similarly, while the FCA supports higher densification in the immediate proximity of major transit stations, the recommendation for unlimited height and unlimited density ignores local context that should contribute to the appropriate planning decision. As well, the proposal to allow as-of-right zoning of 6 to 11 stories on any street utilized by public transit is far too broad. What might be reasonable on arterials with high-frequency transit is not on residential streets with half-hour bus service. As well, the FCA strongly opposes the task force recommendation for open development outside of existing municipal boundaries. Such development contributes to urban sprawl, which is both costly for both taxpayers and the environment. In the task force section, start saying yes in my backyard, the FCA opposes repealing or overriding zoning that preserves the physical character of a neighborhood. When people buy homes, they are also buying into a neighborhood with all its physical characteristics. While neighborhoods can and do change through controlled intensification, such characteristics as tree canopy, streetscape, and compatible building forms ought to form part of the zoning for that neighborhood. Contrary to the task force report, the choice is not binary between not in my backyard and yes in my backyard, but is more nuanced, requiring local decision-making, not a uniform province-wide approach. Consistent with this, the FCA opposition to the imposition of province-wide zoning standards, as this ignores local context, which again contributes to neighborhood attractiveness and quality of life. The task force proposes limiting public meetings on development proposals to the legislative minimum. This ignores the proven value of public consultation that leads to modifications that developers accept, and in turn, better acceptance of development proposals by the public. The FCA opposes this task force recommendation. The task force errs in characterizing the heritage designation process as abuse. Heritage designations do not stop and are not meant to stop new development, but to guide it. The FCA believes heritage conservation is important in preserving historical context in a community and is aware of many examples where redevelopment has occurred successfully in these circumstances. Further, the notion that municipalities should compensate property owners for loss of property values as a result of heritage designations is both unreasonable and untenable, and counters the provincial interest in heritage conservation, which you'll find in Provincial Policy Statement, Section 2.6. The FCA opposes unilaterally restoring the right of developers to appeal municipal official plans to the Ontario Land Tribunal. Why? Only developers. In the task force section, cut red tape. It is clear the developer bias in this task force is showing. Red tape is the process by which public interest is protected by requiring the appropriate studies to support a planning application and ensuring due process. While cutting red tape may serve the developer, it does not always serve the public. The task force proposal to require a $10,000 filing fee for third-party appeals is egregious and must be strongly opposed. As a practical matter, it only permits appeals by the wealthy and is inherently unjust. The task force section proposal to waive development charges and parkland cash in lieu for all infill residential projects of up to 10 units is opposed by the FCA. There has to be compensatory increase in municipal services and parkland amenities as new housing units are added to an existing neighborhood, and the cost of this should not be borne solely by taxpayers. In conclusion, the FCA is disappointed that the Ontario Task Force on Housing Affordability did not spend time on the demand side of housing equation, particularly for low-income families who do not qualify for social rent-geared to income housing and will not be able to buy a home. Access to suitable housing is a key social determinant of health and allows people to participate fully in their community. In our view, the task force addressed only half the problem and not well at that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Alex. Right on time. Nicely done. Councillor Curry has a question for you.
Thank you, Mr. Cullen. One of the things I asked the first speaker was whether he was going to be submitting any feedback to the task force. And one of the questions I'm going to have for staff is who else is going to be submitting feedback? And so when I listened to your presentation, and I read it before you got here, that you're representing 74 members. And so I wonder about whether or not it wouldn't be more beneficial to have 74 members submit something, because I think the question always is, how did you actually get to 74 members and have them read the task force report, come up with feedback, give it to you, compile it in such a short span of time? And is that really representative of 74 members? So have you thought at all about, first of all, if you could help me understand what your consultation was, because in Canada, we constantly struggle with this. You seem to have been able to have gotten 74 members feedback. And whether you think it might be beneficial to send all 74 members feedback instead of just one person saying that they're speaking on behalf of 74 members.
Yes, certainly. And it's not just one person. This does represent the FCA. So I can tell you, when the task force report came out, it created all kinds of waves in the community association community that we represent. It's been a topic on our planning and zoning committee agenda. You've already heard two of our members speak to already from Old Ottawa East and Old Ottawa South. Heritage Ottawa is also a member of the FCA. They're speaking out. And certainly our recommendation to our members would be, please speak out not only to the government, but to your MPP. It's a topic that we'll be talking about at our general meeting coming up to take the next step to inform the provincial government of our point of view. The FCA is a highly consultative process. It's not a top-down organization. It's a bottom-up organization. And often our initiatives come from individual community associations, well, people who have taken the time to read and then come back to us and say, what's the FCA going to do about this? And of course, we have to make sure that everyone is involved. So of course, we communicate. This letter has gone out to all our members, and they've had the opportunity to comment. So we're highly engaged. We will certainly be pushing that individual associations do it, and the FCA will, I expect, will be sending a letter into the minister as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. I might want to talk to you at some other point just about that whole process, because it's one thing we struggle with in Canada all the time. Thanks a lot.
Councillor Brockington.
Thanks, Alex, for your delegation. Appreciate the work the FCA does. We've heard from a number of people who are looking to purchase their first house that they'd like to see, and I'm paraphrasing, basically the elimination of R1 zoning. They're looking at the area that R1 zones occupy and want to see much greater density and intensification. And some people are implying, let's park community fabric concerns, let's park compatibility to the side and simply build more supply. Hopefully more people in homes and can be housed. Why is community vibrancy, community compatibility, respecting community fabric so important?
So it's not as I said earlier, it's not a binary choice. It's not either or. We support what staff are saying that yes, we're going to have intensification. In fact, most of the city has been built through intensification. And quite frankly, good intensification is supported by community associations. What you hear about when it's bad. But in this context that we're talking about is the ability to deal with the other elements of the official plan that make a good neighborhood. So yes, we want that densification, but we want it to respect the tree canopy. We wanted to respect 15-minute neighborhoods. We wanted to respect access to community amenities. That's part of building a community. And we believe the two can be met, that you can have that intensification with these other elements. And that's what it's all about for local planning, local control. And that's what we support. It's a misnomer to say it's yes or no. It's not.
I agree. As you know, we just went through a 3-year OP process where we made compromise after compromise after compromise to try and find that sweet spot on many issues based on what we were hearing from our own residents. We already have a made in Ottawa solution. We now have to implement the OP and the comprehensive zoning bylaw that will follow. So thank you again.
Yep.
Alex, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned existing homeowners, and in your presentation, I think you said when people buy homes, they have an expectation of a certain character. I'm always worried when we're considering planning files, both here at Planning Committee and even in my own local ward planning meetings, that we're putting too much weight on existing homeowners when we're making decisions, and not enough to make sure that we're hearing from people who live in a community who rent, and also people like, say, Dean at the start of this meeting, Mr. Tester, who is someone who wants to move into a community, a future homeowner. Do you think we put too much weight on existing homeowners in these kind of deliberations and consultations?
Well, you have to provide some weight because people, as I said earlier, did buy into community, but no one expects a community to be carved in stone. There is change. I mean, many of us, I'm a I'm a senior with kids who are in the market for buying homes, and so many of us understand that pressure to find affordable housing. And the issue is not either or. It's an issue of, does it meet the compatibility issues or standards that the city has in its official plan? So if you have intensification coming in a neighborhood and it meets you have 2 units, 4 units on a lot that previously only had 1, but it's got the setback, it respects the trees, it doesn't overload amenities, or at least you have amenities to compensate for the increase in that neighborhood, then you're golden. And you can do that. So the balancing act lies with you folks, but you've gone through that public consultation process. No one has said no to intensification in any instance. It is qualified, and that's how you build good communities. It's not just building houses; it's building good communities, and I think you can do that.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Leeper.
Thanks. And forgive me, I guess I'm a little theoretical here, but some of the issue seems to come down again to something that has been on my plate for the last 8 years, which is that our zoning doesn't match the official plan for the most part across the city. And I don't want to be too provocative here, but I'm thinking about the fights over, and I'm sorry, was it Grennan?
Yes, I'm familiar with that one.
Which you're obviously very familiar.
Yes.
Maple Grove in Councillor Hubely's ward. These were long drawn out, very fractious processes. And I wonder the extent to which the provincial government is looking at those and saying, those took far too long for something that council was clearly willing to approve. But I wonder whether it's too much of a pendulum shift toward eliminating regulation, eliminating process, opening up the floodgates, where if we had zoning that actually matched what council intends to be built, whether some of that would take care of the fractiousness of the processes and the opposition that sometimes these projects create.
So with respect to Grennan, again, it was never binary, keep what was already existing versus the 42 units. I believe it was 42 units that went in there. The issue was how many units should go in there. And clearly the community came to planning committee to say, yes, we'll accept more units, but not the 42. I believe it was 36 or some other number. One has to be careful about how one characterizes how the community deals with these things. But the pendulum shift here to expect that the province understands what happens neighborhood by neighborhood in Ottawa. I mean, that's impossible. As Ottawa is not Toronto, so we don't need a Toronto solution. We don't need a Kingston solution. We don't need an Owen Sound solution. You want a made in Ottawa solution. And we're already taking those steps. The staff report makes it very clear. We're on that road to accommodating more growth in our city. We have the tools to do that. The zoning bylaw review will create those tools, and we're willing to participate. We intend to participate. We see the writing on the wall, but what we want is good intensification, not bad intensification. And the provincial approach, just caving into the developer lobby as of right, doesn't protect existing communities to manage change that they can live with, because change is coming no matter what.
My sense is that the growth management strategy that we've passed allows for significant infill intensification across Ottawa that probably doesn't even yet contemplate large swaths of R1 being upzoned to R3. My sense is that our growth management strategy and the comprehensive zoning bylaw review is actually going to create more housing supply than we even anticipate if we go down the path of eliminating some of that R1 zoning in areas where it makes sense. So, okay, Alex, thank you. Always good to see you.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks very much, Alex. Speaker number 9, Tony Miller, was unable to join this morning, so we're going to our final speaker on this item, Alan Cliff. Good morning, Alan.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today. My name's Alan Cliff. I'm a resident of Hintonburg. I'm speaking in my personal capacity, not on behalf of any organization. Also, you can hear my son. I'm on parental leave, and my son is making some submissions as well in the background. If those submissions are too loud, I may have to leave. I just hear that's why. So the main submission that I have, the main comment that I had in reading the staff report is that I think that the city's response could do more to grapple with the severity of the housing shortage or housing crisis. So I just want to take a couple of minutes and talk about the housing shortage. The city can take this opportunity to respond to the province. So on the first point, I saw some figures from the Ottawa Real Estate Board.
Alan, if I may quickly, you're in and out. I think I see the other members nodding. I don't know if turning off your video might give you a bit more bandwidth so it's a smoother experience. Sorry, Chair.
Sure, sorry about that. Is that better?
That is, thank you.
Thanks, Councillor. Yeah, so there's numbers showing condo prices went up 7% on average last year. House prices are up 24%. So our population is growing quickly and the housing supply is not keeping up. And I saw the report that Councillor McKenney referred to from Statistics Canada showing, there's more dwellings. Dwellings are growing faster than population. That's not keeping up with changes in family composition that are increasing the demand for housing faster than we can build. And that's why the prices are supply is not meeting demand. This is a complicated problem. There's no magic levers in order to address the real seize on many families. And you've heard from other speakers about, and I know many of you know personally about the human costs that these prices are having, and their environmental and social consequences as well. When people who want to live in Ottawa are forced to live farther away, to have long commutes, I think there's a pretty clear link between cities that have unaffordable housing generally, that is high market rate housing, tend to have more homelessness because it just becomes harder for everyone up and down the income scale. But it has particularly negative effects on poorer people, younger people, and other communities that have lower rates of homeownership. So I think this is an equity issue as well as just an economic one. So what can Ottawa do? I think I was pleased to see that the report prepared by staff acknowledges in the summary that there's a housing crisis, because that's something that doesn't appear in the draft official plan. It doesn't mention the housing crisis. So I think it's good that we take this opportunity to do that. But that doesn't come through in the text of the city position. So for example, we take no position on the 1.5 million target, whether it's a good idea or not. By my sort of back of the envelope calculations, and I think this lines up with what Steve Willis mentioned earlier, the target would be 30 or 40% more ambitious than the numbers in the official plan. So I think it's sort of incumbent on the city to say, do we think this official plan is enough, in which case we should be opposing the target, which I don't agree with, or should we really be stepping up to address these concerns so that we can tell our kids that they will be able to afford houses or apartments in our neighborhoods, because ultimately rental prices are closely linked to house prices. The other thing I just wanted to mention, there was some interesting back and forth among the other speakers. It's clear that there is a trade-off between building more housing supply quickly and addressing existing residents' concerns. And we can try to find compromise, but ultimately you have to trade. There is some trade-off there. Part of the problem is, I agree, too much weight gets attached to existing residents because the future residents aren't here yet. They don't have a voice. But another problem, and maybe a bigger problem, is that the process itself seems to be designed around existing residents. And we add extra layers of consultation, extra layers of appeal without thinking about what that's doing to aggravate the housing shortage. So thanks for the opportunity to speak. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much, Alan. Councillor McKenney has a question for you.
I do. Thanks, Alan. I'm glad that you were able to get the bandwidth because I agree with much of what you said. And I just want to circle back around to the issue of, the census data that came out that did show that, housing supply was rising at a, moderately higher rate than population. However, that's net, right? And I understand that. And I think the important thing is that we obviously need supply. We need housing supply. And we need it. We need intensification, and we need that intensification in existing communities. So there's always that conflict. But I guess where I'm always concerned, because I care very deeply about housing affordability for people who have no homes, people who have, cannot rent, and for people who want to purchase homes. People should have, there should be housing options to meet everyone's needs. That would be the healthiest type of community and city we would build. But I just want to go back to the demand side. And I think that, and I just wonder if you agree with this, that if we, and I'm not an economist, I think about housing a lot, but I'm not an economist. But if in fact, it's shown that there are more people, and the data also bore this out, that more people are choosing to live alone rather than in couples, right? So we have more single person households. That is, and that's the type of demand that I think if we pull away some of the decision-making power at the local level, it means that we miss the opportunity to address what's happening in our cities, right? So things in Toronto are different than things in Ottawa, and things in Ottawa are very different than how we plan and how we're building, say, in Sudbury. And an 11-story building on a corridor in one city might be very different from another, and the number of units that we're building, that we're moving forward on, doesn't match what the demand is. Then that's where I have a problem with only looking at supply. I believe in supply. I think it has to be matched up. And that's where I see the decision-making at the local level being important. I just wonder if you had.
Thanks, Councillor. And I don't think we should only look at supply. I don't know very much about the demand side things. My feeling is demand side on its own is never going to be enough, because there's too many factors that are going to push on the demand side. So we need to get supply as well. And so I think that this report, that in responding to this report, it would be a good opportunity for the city to say, we get it. This is a crisis. You guys at Queen's Park, pull your levers. We're going to do whatever we can to pull our levers too, because it'll take all the levers in order to address the crisis in a real way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, you're right. At each level of government, it will take for sure. Anyway, I appreciate your input, Alan. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm seeing no more questions. So thanks, Alan, for your presentation today. We appreciate it. All right, we are finished our public delegations. What I'd like to do now is there are a number of motions that various people have. So we're going to go to motions and then we'll go to questions for staff. I have a motion, Kelly, if you could bring it up. Thank you. So therefore be it resolved that recommendation 3 be revised to request that Mayor Watson and the co-chairs of Planning Committee on behalf of council make representations to the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, detail the city's position with a focus on increasing provincial support for affordable housing, ensuring that meaningful public participation and engagement in the planning process is maintained, maintaining local context considerations, including the importance of heritage protections, and maintaining equitable OLT appeal rights for residents and community groups. Just quickly, my intention here is I kind of see the staff report as almost a technical response to the provincial housing report. But if we're going to ask the mayor and Chair Moffat and I, if committee accepts this, to make representations to the province, we want to be focusing on the items that are of the most importance based on what we've heard today from community members and what we've received through public consultations. So just trying to highlight 4 main points that do come up again and again that I think deserve some extra consideration and focus if we're speaking with the province on this. So that's my motion. I believe Councillor Fleury has some motions that are going to be introduced by Councillor Leeper, but Councillor Fleury, since you're here, you might as well read them and introduce. We'll get them on the screen first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to begin by thanking Councillor Leeper for moving them on my behalf, and also Mr. Willis for taking the time with me to go over the report and areas of clarification and helping with the motions here. So maybe the first one, Kelly, would be the OLT. And Chair, I'm in your hands. I can explain and read the therefore be it resolved, or I can read the full motion, whatever you're comfortable with.
Why don't you read quickly, Matt? And
whereas the province of Ontario released 55 recommendations through its the Ontario Affordable Task Force, whereas the recommendations 26 through 31 seeks to weed out or prevent appeals the task force believes is aimed at delaying projects, whereas the task force points to latest data from the Ontario Land Tribunal's 2019-2020 report states that there are more than 1,300 unresolved cases, whereas the National Capital Region's latest growth population statistics show that it is the 4th largest growing urban area in the country, and whereas the Statistics Canada report reports Ottawa's 2021 population alone is now 1.4 million in population, whereas the recommendation numbers 26 states that the province should require appellants to promptly seek permission, leave to appeal to the tribunal, and demonstrate that the appeal has merit, relying on evidence and expert reports before it is accepted. And whereas the city report states that it has no concerns provided to the province to restore an office to advise community organization and other stakeholders on the mechanics of filing a proper appeal. And whereas the city further states resources would also need to be provided to the Ontario Land Tribunal so that an expeditious review of the material provided on the leave application could be done and not cause delay. And whereas recommendation 30 requests the province to provide funding to increase staffing, adjudicators and case managers, provide market competitive salary, outsource more matters to mediators, and set shorter time targets. And whereas the city supports this recommendation, but to be successful, this recommendation should reflect the specific needs of the National Capital Region. Therefore, be it resolved that this council requests the Solicitor General to create an Eastern Ontario Landlord Tribunal to address the backlog and allow for timely reviews in Ottawa. And be it further resolved that following the city's recommendation, this Eastern office include an office to advise community organizations or other stakeholders on the mechanics of filing a proper appeal.
Okay, thanks, Matt. And you've got 1 or 2 others on this item as well, I think.
Yes, I have one on public lands, very similar colleagues to the motion that we carried on the OP. But now that the province is opening its interest on us seeing more development, I'm rephasing or reframing it specifically on provincial land and crown. So whereas the city of Ottawa is proud to be the capital, Canada's capital, whereas the city includes unique neighborhoods and villages, whereas communities evolve and need change, and at times school properties being unused for education purposes due to change in neighborhood demographics, whereas many public lands are vacant and offer development opportunities, whereas the city has not signified the city's objectives for the development of these federal, provincial, crown agencies and city public land, whereas these lands should be considered in a complete community lens ahead of development and redevelopment, whereas the city has unique opportunities to ensure that publicly owned land meet the introducing a full range of affordability and increase the number of rental housing stock, whereas the Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force mandate was explore measures to address housing needs, whereas government-owned lands was outside of the mandate, but many stakeholders noted the value of surplus and underused public land and land associated with major transit investments in finding housing solutions, whereas several stakeholders on the task force raised issues that they believe that have merit in further consideration. Whereas in Ottawa, there are a number of vacant lands to be considered as underused, including, but not limited to, federal vacant lands, such as the former Canada Post, MTO 417 lands no longer being used by transportation expansion, provincial vacant school lands. Whereas the task force did recommend to permit as of right conversion of underutilized or redundant commercial properties to residential or mixed residential and commercial use. Whereas the city has no concerns with this proposal, provided that there are appropriate checks and balances to address land use compatibility between sensitive land uses and industrial uses that may be adjacent. Therefore, it be resolved that the city requests that the province of Ontario, based on their affordable housing task force recommendations, include renewed policies to easily transfer provincially owned land within Ottawa to unlock housing options on vacant or empty provincial properties, including crown agencies such as the LCBO, MTO, and school boards.
Okay, and you've got one more? Two more? Okay.
For the PPS, the provincial policy statement. So this one relates, colleagues, to earlier delegation and something that we had flagged through the report, whereas the province of Ontario released its 55 recommendations.
Matt,
yes.
Why don't you jump down to the therefore be it resolved?
Therefore, I'd be glad to. So be it for, I can explain it after. So be it further resolved, the City of Ottawa agrees that the province needs to lead a discussion on ways to remove exclusionary zoning that inhibits allowing a variety of housing types in neighborhoods in Ontario, that the city encourage the province to adapt the provincial policy statement and issue best practices. But the City of Ottawa wants to retain the right to adapt any new standards to local conditions. And then the final one is on site plan. Again, very similar to the OP conversation, but ties in a number of things that were presented in this in the task force recommendation, specifically heritage conservation districts and site plan elements. So therefore, be it resolved that committee directs staff to clarify in their report ahead of replying to the province the importance of site plan and its current review process in certain neighborhoods and in communities that have been rezoned or are zoned residential for density and not exempted from public consultation and input.
Okay, thank you, Matt. That's it. 4 motions from Councillor Fleury. Are there any other motions? Or Councillor Leeper has his hand up? No, okay. Any other motions? Okay, let's go to questions for staff. Is that your hand up for staff, Jeff?
It is. Thanks, thanks, Chair. So I'm going to keep it really brief. I mean, I fundamentally agree with the city's positions on pretty much all of this. I am wondering, given what we've heard from delegations around the OLT, whether we can bump up that language to make it stronger before council. And I would be very happy to chat with anyone who wants to talk about that. But the essentially ripping away the appeal rights from community groups strikes me as a very inequitable way to treat that quasi-judicial system. The question that I have, though, is with respect to site plan. We're going to talk about green building standards, the high performance development standards, as the next item today. The legislative basis for being able to apply green standards to buildings comes from our authority over site plan. If the province were to remove site plan requirements, do we then lose our leverage to implement high performance design standards?
So chairs and Mr. Mark may wish to add to what I say about this. I do believe that many of the standards are in peril if we lose those legislative authorities. We could still do some things, but much of what is before you later in the agenda would become out of scope of municipal authority.
Yeah, so that's a big concern for me, our ability to get better design, understanding the trade-offs, right? The opposition to high performance design standards, some of that relates to housing affordability, which is obviously counter to what the province is trying to achieve here. But I do believe that in our response to the province, we should be pointing out that there are a lot of sustainability considerations in light of the climate crisis that we have that need to be considered, and that if we lose site plan as legislative authority to impose high performance design standards, we need a tool that will replace that, because otherwise the conversation we're going to have will become moot in many ways this afternoon. So I'd ask you to give that some consideration. And I'll be interested to hear from my colleagues as to whether or not there's an appetite for some stronger language around the OLT. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Councillor Cloutier.
Thank you, Chair. Merci beaucoup, and thank you to staff for the report and the presentation. Just a couple of quick questions. Recommendation 3 of the report, not the third recommendation from staff that was possibly amended by the Councillor Fleury's motion, but the limit exclusionary zoning. It would allow as of right housing up to 4 units on a single residential lot. And if these policies are adopted by the province, considering the new OP states that single family homes are also allowed to be built and rebuilt on lots, how do those policies reconcile?
So chairs, again, this isn't legislation yet, it's a proposal. We'd have to see the context of the legislation and how it would apply. Much as we ran into this very issue during the official plan, the issue of continuing rights versus new rights will be part of the transition provisions of the new legislation. And chairs, we're watching any introduction of legislation closely, and we'll issue a memo to council when we see it's out there. And that's a question we will be tracking. But I can't answer the councillor's question today without seeing the actual text of legislation if the province goes there.
Thank you for that. But the city supports the intent of the proposal and is the response by the city. So if the task force recommends allowing up to four units as of right, I wonder if there will be retaining the right for single family homes to be built as well. But thank you. I recognize that it's not legislation. Just one more question quickly about the tree canopy. The recommendations, the directions, the potential legislation, if implemented, what impact would it have on our targets, our objectives of a 40% tree canopy?
So Chair, complex question to answer. And so it's hard to give you a straightforward answer on this. My take on this, and this is something we're going to have to wrestle with in our zoning, regardless of what the province does in this space. We're having good internal discussions and staff now about whether or not we need to revisit front yard setback requirements in certain neighborhoods that have very, very minimal front yard setback requirements in order to have the goals of the intensification and the tree canopy as well. So that will be something we're looking at in our zoning bylaw. It is actually part of our work plan strategy. And the more units they allow, the more we're going to have to look at the performance standards around the lot to balance out the different priorities.
Thank you. Thank you. We have the new tree bylaw that's less than 2 years old. We all support, and I hope those policies are taken into account with respect to the city's response and with respect to this process moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Willis. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Brockington.
Thanks, Chair. Mr. Willis, do you know on average how many dwelling units are built in Ontario in a given year?
Chairs, I don't have that data for Ontario. I could look it up, see whether the task force represents it, and maybe Ms. Brody, if you can scan through the document and text me if you have that. I know in Ottawa, we oscillate between 5,500 and 6,900, depending on economic conditions a year. That's the Ottawa number. And it's very tied to the health of the local economy and how much houses are being sold. So trying to multiply that math out, I think one of the deputants actually did have a reference to the provincial number, talked about it being a 1/3 increase, and it's about right, because it's about the same numbers I'm giving locally. So I would imagine that's about right.
The 1.5 million over a decade is the total number of units, correct? It's not a net increase.
I believe it's a total number of new units they need to be built.
So I guess where I'm going with this is I want to ensure that if the province is going to proceed with sort of a new policy direction or revise, that it's going to have a net benefit. There's going to be a net increase of units as a direct result of these recommendations. The province has, since they took office, have been looking at ways to reduce barriers to construct housing. And I want to make sure that if this goes through, obviously, that the intended results actually happen, they're measurable. I do have some questions for staff directly in response to some motions that were put on the floor. One from Councillor Fleury talks about the province needs to lead a discussion on ways to remove exclusionary zoning that inhibits allowing a variety of housing types and neighborhoods in Ontario. What does that actually mean? We want to ask the province, don't remove exclusionary zoning yet, engage in a conversation. Is that the road they're actually going down, or are they very eager to remove exclusionary zoning at this time?
So Chair, if Councillor Fleury feels it's appropriate, I answer on his behalf. He's okay with that. I think what we're framing, the intent of Councillor Fleury's motion, and I did give him some advice on the wording of it, is I think people understand that to address the housing needs of Ontario, we need to break down some of the traditional zoning systems that all around North America, there are jurisdictions questioning the way we're doing it. And many jurisdictions have gone so far as to eliminate R1 zoning. We did not do that in Ottawa in the new official plan, but we did talk about where it needs to be eaten into and transformed for multifamily. And I think the province could lead in municipal discussion across the province among municipalities about how to do it. But, we maintain the position that we should, notwithstanding the province should set some direction and guidance and tell us what they want us to achieve. We have, like the PPS already is constructed, we should be allowed to customize it to the Ottawa context. The PPS as it's constructed today gives provincial guidance, but does give council the authority to take local context into account. And that's the way we think the process should continue.
Okay, so this is the most dicey issue in my ward. And I know there are others about, the cost of appealing and engagement. That's very important. But the recommendations coming from this task force does not recommend eliminating R1 zoning, but how close do their set of recommendations get to it? Can you just summarize that?
I'm Chairs, it's very hard for me to read the minds of the panelists on the task force. I think there's a lot, they must have had an internal discussion about whether they would go there or not, because much of the language in the report really does dance around the edges of this. I'm sure they struggled much as council itself did when it adopted the new official plan about trying to find a balanced approach. And this is the problem, is that it's hard to do a one size fits all across the province, because what might be appropriate in Toronto wouldn't be appropriate here, and what might be appropriate here wouldn't be appropriate in Kingston. Like it is a very, very difficult problem. And I think we still believe as staff that municipal planning approaches are still valid rather than provincially led. But I think the intent, and again, I'm speaking on Councillor Fleury's behalf here because of his motion, I think the intent is that municipalities will struggle to do this on their own unless the province leads the discussion. And I think that's the intent of Councillor Fleury's motion, and I would ask him to confirm that's his thinking.
Just we have heard from the colleagues of mine during the OP discussion that there is a willingness to look at R1 and maybe even eliminating R1. And I want to make sure that this motion does not feed into that political intent. Rather, it's ensuring Ottawa has a seat at the table so that if we're going down this road, we get to be there. We get to help guide the final outcome. So can you confirm that this motion as worded is in the best interests of the city of Ottawa, and that's something that you can endorse?
So Councillor, if I may clarify, I believe Councillor Fleury should also respond, but the wording that I suggested to Councillor Fleury does not make this a mandatory item. It says the province has to lead a conversation, and we would expect as the second largest city in the province of Ontario to be at the table. So I do believe it's in our interests to be at the table, and I think it's useful for the province to lead a conversation, and I think it's useful to have an intermunicipal dialogue on this issue so that we can come up with some good approaches in collaboration with our partners in other cities in Ontario.
Councillor Fleury, do you want to respond as well?
Yeah, no, and thank you, Mr. Willis, and thank you, Councillor Brockington, for your questions. I think they're very relevant for the context. We have an OP with its directions, and the next council will have its zoning review bylaw. In the meantime, we could be steamrolled by a report like this. If tomorrow the province just removed R1, we lose any of, and if you look, it's embedded in different parts of the report, the site plan, the heritage component. So this motion is really meant to show our cards, saying we recognize the risk of where you're heading. We have our local context and we want to be engaged on. That's all this does. Yeah, and Mr. Willis, that's the direction I think you're clear on. Like it does not remove R1 at this point, but it states that we're worried that the province might remove R1, and we want to be at the table if you do, to not lose the local context.
I just think if the task force didn't go that far, then why are we now wanting to engage in that type of conversation? And if we believe we need to protect ourselves and that the province is going to go further, even though it may not be addressed in the task force set of recommendations, then yeah, I'll support that. But I don't want to engage in a conversation that could be quite damaging to many of our neighborhoods if we don't have to, if the province has told us they're not going to go that far. And this conversation is very helpful. I was just trying to understand, is your motion because the province is going that direction and we want to see it at the table? Is it more because we're worried that potentially could come up and we want to flag it early and get a seat at the table? That's very noble, but that's the reason behind my questions in that regard. I have others. I'm going to yield because there's a long lineup, and perhaps I'll come back. Thank you.
Okay, I just wanted to note the question about home growth. The report says building 1.5 million homes in 10 years would mean doubling how many homes in Ontario are built currently each year. So rough numbers, I'm sure, but gives us an idea. Councillor Curry.
I just wanted to say, when I hear people talk about this, and sometimes it's in interviews, sometimes it's in writing, they refer to this task force report as a seminal document. And when people start talking about it as a seminal document and it gets legs with that, I wonder how much anything we're going to do here is going to make a difference. And I hate questions that ask for crystal balling, but we are giving feedback. You know, some of the groups today may give feedback. I asked one of the presenters about 74 voices. So we send all this feedback. We say, this is what we think. We think our communities don't like this. We don't think it's going to be good. We agree with some parts. Do you really think that there's a value to this, that they would actually listen? Because when they talk about it as a seminal document, we've got a provincial election coming up. I'm wondering if what we're doing here is enough and if it will be listened to. You know, what are your thoughts about whether this will have really an impact, what we're trying to do here today?
So chairs, again, a very terribly difficult question to answer, but I will go back in time that when the province proposed very, very major changes to municipal financing in Bill 108, the city of Ottawa stood up and asked for no changes to cash in lieu of parkland, and the province did actually listen and backed off in Bill 108. So that's recent experience for the city, and I do believe that when I discuss this with my counterparts from around the province, there's sort of a sense that if the city could flag to the province things it can support and things it cannot support, maybe the province will listen if there is an emerging consensus about what the split between that is. And there's no way I can predict what they will do, but I do think multiple municipalities saying very similar things is beneficial. And I do believe Ottawa should have a voice in response to the province.
And so that is actually my second question. Are there other municipalities we already know of that will be saying similar things, that we sound as a united voice?
Chairs, I had conversations with many of my counterparts around Ontario. I've seen some of the reports coming out, and there's some very, very common themes emerging. And I don't know if one of the members of council can talk to AMO's position, but I believe AMO is also, I believe, Councillor Brockington, if I'm correct, is our AMO representative. Maybe he can remark about what AMO's position has been on this.
Councillor Brockington, did you want to give a quick overview or on the response?
I will need to dig up some files, which I'll do now, and perhaps in a few minutes I can provide you with a more detailed reply.
Fair enough. And Councillor Brockington, I remember you did circulate AMO's position paper on the provincial report, which is a very good read as well.
Okay, well, I guess I would say that gives me some hope that there is actually some benefit to what we're saying and doing here. But I will just echo what Councillor Leeper had said, that if we don't have any impact here, all that we're about to talk about later in this agenda is at risk. You know, this is a fairly significant thing. Anyway, I appreciate everyone's comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Councillor Kitts.
Thank you, Chair. I do have somewhat mixed views on what's in front of us today, because I don't disagree with the delegates that were here today saying our current planning process can and does at times impede our ability to increase our housing stock. We see opposition to infill and density projects, big and small, across the city every 2 weeks at this committee. But at the same time, as a councillor in a high growth area, you know, I really endeavor to get community input to improve the ultimate outcome of the development projects that come forward in my ward. And I really value that input. And I do think it's important to acknowledge, as I believe as co-chair Gower did, that so often when we're discussing planning applications, we're hearing from the local homeowners or advocacy groups, and we're not hearing from future community members who aren't part of the conversation because they're still hunting for a community to belong to. And we heard from some of those folks today in the delegations. So, you know, I feel it is important for me to speak as a millennial. You know, I'm a 33-year-old counselor. I've experienced some of these challenges myself. You all know I'm a proud Navanite, but I do live 40 kilometers from my workplace. I'm still in the city limits, obviously, but I'm not far from the border. So all that said, my question to you, Mr. Willis, is where is the healthy middle between removing all consultation and letting the province completely run roughshod over our planning decisions, but and permitting for some good community input that allows for suggestions and improvements on applications? In your view, how can we strike that balance? Because it feels a bit like it's all or nothing.
Chairs, I like the way Councillor Kitts characterized the debate here. I mean, you know, every opportunity I get, I say the best consultation is the consultation that happens before an application is ever filed, because a lot of development proponents spends hundreds of thousands of dollars to meet our application requirements, and they do that based on one design concept. So the earlier they get out and consult the community ahead of an application, the more advantageous it is to both the applicant and the community, because it's the time when change is most likely to happen. The later we get in the process, the amount of room and willingness either side has to change will diminish. And that's based on my professional experience, not based on any rule of thumb. But there is value in public consultation. A lot of designs are improved through that. But we also struggle as a municipality to get things processed in a timely manner. And that's why earlier conversations are better, for sure. And so I think the staff position in this is really urging the province to not go too hard down that road, because there are risks to that. And it'll play out in other ways. Like, you know, any consultation that doesn't happen will come up. The concerns and complaints will come in another way. And I'll just give you an example of that is that, you know, forgive me, Councillor Leeper, for picking on Councillor Leeper, but, you know, developments approved as of right in his ward will generate, they're as of right. They didn't require any approval from the department. And they'll generate lots of issues that might have been avoided had the file been discussed ahead of time. And I just because Councillor and I are dealing with these every couple of weeks, this is the sort of thing where there is value in the process to avoid those concerns.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that response. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Fleury. Councillor Fleury.
Yeah, sorry about that. Steve, I just wanted to come back and thank you for the time. One of the points that you made, and I went back to the YouTube throughout the speakers, I think you're at 25 minutes on YouTube, you presented something very clear that all residents in Ottawa and all community associations should really listen to. The 3-4 points that you made around the impacts on housing and that how the report was written, I think is extremely well articulated and important for all stakeholders, no matter which side you're on, to listen to. To me, in the area I represent and my responsibility with OCH and understanding the wait list, I think your first point was the most important one, which is the title and name of this report is confusing. Most people think of affordable housing. They think of our wait list for affordable housing. They don't think about affordable home ownership, which I think is what what you highlight in this report and the various elements of that. I want to come back on a couple of elements in the report, particularly point 32. On point 32, page 30, there is something about infill that raises an eyebrow to me. We have a provincial recommendation, a task force recommendation that says all these things about site plan, heritage, and so on. And we've done a lot of that work recently with the OP, which, you know, commends us in being ahead of that. And it's unfortunate the province doesn't fully capture how far we went in the OP. But I'm concerned when we think that infill should escape the waiver of DC charges and cash in them. And I wonder if you can express what that would mean for our city, because ultimately there is a cost to seeing new residents moving into a neighborhood. Maybe not the water pipe or a sidewalk, although sometimes it's missing. But thinking that the cost of development pays for the cost of development, I don't think that we've articulated what that means in infill conditions. I wonder if you could say that for the record.
So, Chair, as you know, in the new official plan, you know, we have a lot of, you know, of the 195,000 new housing units we predicted we need, and the plan was adopted on the basis of that. 49,000 of them need to be larger household units, which are largely done not through towers, but are done through low-rise infill projects. So a lot of our intensification targets are based on more and more being done in low-rise form going into areas, particularly those well served by transit. And if we were to exempt what's now going to become the majority of our new units from development charges, those development charges, you know, the largest dollar figure of development charges in Ottawa pays for public transit right now, the entire public transit system. You know, the second largest is in roads, but we also have affordable housing, recreation, amenities, libraries, policing, ambulance services, and the like. So the development charges is a very crucial tool for the city to raise money to deal with the incremental cost of growth and population. If we don't have that money coming in through development charges, it will come to the general tax base. There is no other option for that. Some of it could go onto the water bills, but the rest would come on the tax base. So the city has concerns about it. The government did provide a provision for both deferral and exemption of affordable, truly affordable housing units, and the city has supported that in the past, but providing an across the board exemption would be detrimental to the city's finances.
I think that's very important because in the report, it's very not generic. It's clear that development should pay for development, but it does not say what you just said. We're going towards a majority of infill, and here's what infill pays for. I wonder if that could be basically if you're able to take that as a direction and amend that segment of the report with such language, because I think it is pertinent to financial well-being and growth of the city.
So Chair, I've had a few comments from a few councillors of how we could punch up the language on explaining the rationale behind the city's position. And again, between now and council, we can generate a refined version to put some emphasis on points committee wishes us to punctuate.
Okay, Chair, I'm very cognizant of the time I took. I have two more quick questions. On on point 12, section D, there's a recommendation to remove floor plate. And I thought, man, we did a lot of work. Members of council that have been here for a few years, I'm looking to Councillor Moffat, Councillor Tierney, and Cloutier particularly. It's like we went for high rises that are much more separation distances, floor plate. So I wonder if we capture the magic of that. It seems almost like a Toronto clause to me, and not representative of the character of Ottawa's high-rise environment.
So Chairs, I will say that I have heard from the industry that sometimes our provisions are not very context sensitive, and that, but they do have an out. They can go to the Committee of Adjustment for a revision to that standard based on site-specific context. So I think this is, again, goes back to the point similar to the motion I provided advice on, is there's nothing wrong with a province-wide conversation about these standards and whether or not, you know, if Ottawa is more restrictive than Hamilton, maybe we can align ourselves a little bit better so there's more predictability in this. I don't think anybody opposes that. And if somebody has found a better way of analyzing this, we're more than open to that conversation. So I think really the point of staff's position on this, recommended to council's position, is that the conversation can happen province-wide, but and we defend the work we've done, but you know, maybe we can learn and improve our process based on a provincial conversation.
Okay, I'd have one more question. My final one is point 48, the Ontario Housing Delivery Fund. What does that mean? What does that mean to you? When I read that, I'm really unclear about that objective.
So Chair, I don't know if Saeed's on the call because I know he assisted in writing the response on this, and if he's not, I will take a shot at it.
If not, I'll save some time and take it offline before council. Thanks. Okay, thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. Councillor Menard.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just wanted to start by saying I very much appreciate staff's. Oh, sorry, can you hear me okay? Is it coming through all right?
Yep, you're very good.
Fantastic. Okay. Just very much appreciate staff's work and responses here. I think it's very important to point out, as you've done, the many factors that affect price and rent increases, affecting households that have, you know, substantially accumulated equity from persistent depreciation in their home values, as well as the strong income growth that has taken place and the declining and historically low mortgage rates. there are other factors as well that are contributing to this. We've been seeing fewer homes listed for sale on the MLS for all through the pandemic. That has a major effect, and I suspect with some of the rising interest rates and a carrying through of some more listings that will occur, post pandemic, there will be a lot of other factors that affect this far more than what the provincial report will do. Your comments about each of the different responses, I think staff have done a very, very good job on a number of them. I just wanted to ask to staff two questions. One is, in terms of the process, I've sent in some of our own comments on our replies. Is it that you'll take those before council and adjust based on what feedback you're getting from councillors on the specifics, or is there some other process needed?
So Chairs, as I said at the beginning, the goal of this report is to take something that's staff's position and make it council's position. And if council wants us to emphasize, punch up, change some of the elements, councillors are welcome to provide the suggestions to me, and we'll work with the chairs, and provided that their comments are in alignment and not a change in direction. Especially when we're adding context to the why, which a lot of the comments I've heard from councillors really are about. We'll provide a replacement version which can be moved on the floor of council with track changes so people can see where we changed it. And staff are willing to do that if that's council's direction, or committee's direction, excuse me.
I think it's a good process because then you can kind of wrap up all the comments you're getting. We don't have to all come with motions right here today, and can take the comments we've given you kind of offline and wrap them up, and people can see those changes. So I appreciate that. I won't go through each one of them then that we've sent it on, because most of them we just fully agree with. There's a few that I think could just use some more language in there. The second question I had for you before I make some comments is just around what your feeling is the province right now. I think you said this is coming forward before the next election, it looks like. Are staff in the province supportive of this report? Are you anticipating through just intelligence that you have at the provincial level that many of these recommendations potentially get approved as is? I just would like more intel, if you have it, on where things stand in the province, both on the staff side and politically as you can.
So chairs, I can only rely on what's on the public record. And at the day that the task force report was provided to the province, I believe Minister Clark said there would be amendments before the end of this term of the legislature. As far as ministry staff go and their position on, I really have no read on that. I know, like us, they are working hard on this topic. It's a front burner topic for them, but I can't begin to tell you what staff position is. And again, as the process of the province is quite different as a municipal process, because ultimately decisions are made by cabinet.
Okay, I think the more we can give back to us as we see this moving, I know your staff will be on it in terms of just telling us what gets tabled and what doesn't, and what we can expect. So I appreciate that. I do want to just make some comments about this. I think the report really is, unfortunately, provincial report, an evisceration of democratic oversight of the development industry and of our own shared built environment. And I think the province really has been doubling down on this sort of YIMBY versus NIMBY false dichotomy. And it's a narrative that benefits, industry and their financial backers, which really have had a huge effect on this report. I think recommendation after recommendation, we would see subsidies or save costs for development industry at the expense of taxpayers, residents, and democratic oversight. And the assumption is that making development more profitable for developers will make housing more affordable for residents. And we've not seen evidence of that. On the demand side, we know there's a lot of demand out there, and it is separated from the basic need for shelter. Demand for corporate income properties and demand for speculative investment. The only way to make housing affordable is to start taking it out of the market entirely and not letting the market run wild. And so housing is never going to be cheaper with with simply more profits for developers added onto the bill, and deliberative development processes would be more efficient if the interest of private profit wasn't always pitted against community benefit. If the province is serious about affordable housing and housing affordability, then they should invest in it. That's the supply that's needed. We need public housing. There's not a lot of profit to be made from that, but that's what we need. And instead, we have a plan that really seeks to, develop 1.5 million new homes, none of which would be classified as non-market, as far as I can tell. And so we're very much talking about, we aren't talking about demand much. We're talking about supply. We're not talking about demand. And the tax advantages, the trading up of existing homeowners, the role of developers, which we often take down affordable housing and put up more units, but the units are usually double or triple the price that of the home we took down. And to Councillor McKenney's point, it's not just population, but homes have outpaced households. We are building in Canada. It takes into account those single living folks or the changes. Homes are outpacing households. Nationally, between 2006 and 2016, Canada added 1.636 million households and built 1.92 million new homes. That's CMHC and census data. So on average, almost 30,000 extra homes were constructed each year compared to the increase in the number of households. It's not just a supply issue is the point of that. There is a supply portion of this, but it's not, the bigger factors are much greater than that. And Steve Pomeroy writes extensively about this. I'd ask all folks to read Steve Pomeroy on the demand side. It's not just the quantity of demand either, but the quality of demand that he writes about. And over the last few decades, we've seen supercharged demand, which has been created by households that have substantial accumulated equity from persistent appreciation in their home values, combined with strong income growth and declining mortgage rates. So I think it's taken for granted that and assumed that the surge in supply will have a trickle-down benefit for consumers, but the price of housing is not determined by that simple supply and demand curve only. Housing is not a typical commodity, and that's why it's not considered as part of CPI for that reason. So I'm really glad we're having the discussion. I just wish it came in a better context than it is right now, and I hope that the staff report can help create these arguments at the provincial level. So appreciate your work. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Menard. Councillor Kavanagh.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to staff for their counter proposals. I have to admit, I found it really strange that in a conversation about affordable housing, we have somebody who admittedly makes $100,000 coming because they can't buy a house. That seems very strange when we as councillors know the need for affordable housing in a different context based on people being on a waiting list and needing housing. It is a strange world. And one of the concerns I have is the gender lens, because we're not, like single families weren't even, single parent families were hardly mentioned. And we're talking about people with kids and people that really need housing. And it's just another number. And I think we have to show that there's a need for that particular demographic. I get a little worried when we lump affordable housing as one big lump, and we don't look at the big picture, because I am concerned about the missing middle, which would help many people, and those with families, because when we start looking at what's offered to us, number of affordable housings in an apartment building, we don't even have control over what size units they're going to give us. So I just wanted your comments on that and how we can put the gender lens on this.
So chairs, I think first and foremost, as we indicated, this report was about market housing for the most part. There were a couple of comments at the end, which staff had some recommendations where the advising the province about where their energy is best focused on. And as I said, our housing services staff are in the best position to explain the nuance that they suggested. And, you know, when we did the official plan and looked at the gender issue, gender lens issue, you know, it did point to the need for ground-oriented, multi-bedroom, larger unit housing. And that's why the plan puts so much emphasis on trying to accommodate that. And that's why we've always felt that the Ottawa version of a bigger city, a 1.5 million city, 1.4 and change city, is, you know, more like the Montreal model, as I've often said, where it's lower rise and it actually has bigger units that actually can deal with families, rather than the Vancouver model, which is all towers, you know, which is not great for families. And even though the city is doing admirable work to try to crack that nut, I'm not criticizing my counterparts there. I just think that that's why our plan is organized the way it did. And you know, clearly it wasn't in the task force's terms of reference to address that issue. So I don't know there's much more useful I can say on their response to it.
No, I appreciate it. I just hope that we push back on it, because I appreciate that. I should have said that our official plan did have the gender lens, and that was, of course, very welcome. We did a good job, and that's a step forward. But when we get a report that doesn't do that, I think we have to push back and say that hey, you forgot something very important here. It's not just figuring out you know, where to put more units and taking down different restrictions, but you've got to look at the demographics of who needs housing and who's really hurt in these situations. Is it possible to have that in our response?
Chairs, my recommendation is that when council's representatives, being the mayor or the mayor's designates as the report contemplates, has a conversation with the province, I think that's a good point for them to raise. I'm not sure that, you know, we certainly can weave it into our cover letter to the province in terms of the submission to staff level.
Thank you. One of the things that's talked about is infill. But in my experience, just in my neighborhoods, and I think it's pretty true, is they're the least affordable housing. That infill, like taking down a house, putting up a couple of units, it tends to be in neighborhoods that are well loved and everybody wants to be in, and therefore the price is really high, even though there are 2 units as opposed to 1. You know about it very much. That's a concern, and it sort of speaks again to still working on the missing middle, trying to get even more units. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, chairs, I go back to the official plan. The official plan says in more areas of the city, not just those close to the river where incredibly desirable neighborhoods, very high value neighborhoods, we need to have in more neighborhoods and more parts of the city, more permissions of more typologies of housing. That's what the official plan did. And so if we can distribute multi-unit housing and over more of the city, that will accomplish that goal. You know, right now, just some interesting stats provided by my staff. I know one of the councillors was texting me about this, but 46% of the lots in the city that are residential are zoned R1. 14% of them are R2, which allows a duplex and a single family, and 29% of them are R3, which allows up to a triplex. So that means 89% of the lots within the city would not allow more than a triplex of the in development types, you know, with almost half only allowing a single family dwelling. And as much as it's fair to protect the integrity of neighborhoods, it's also fair to introduce new, more diverse housing typologies in more areas of the city, because it is a balance of public interests that we're dealing with here. And I will give council credit that council adopted a courageous new official plan that would have us have that conversation. It's a chance for us to deal with that. So I think that's the answer to the councillor's question.
Thank you. I think that the other thing that I hear from communities is that some neighborhoods feel well, because of our whole designation of inner urban versus outer urban and other, that some neighborhoods are obviously going to be more picked on or will be set up for more intensification. Should it be across the board? Maybe that's, I mean, we put that in our official plan, but does it kind of throw that out the window?
So chairs, first of all, it's important to remember that any new neighborhood created in a greenfield area is a minimum of R3 zoning, and it's been that way since amalgamation. So we have not created brand new neighborhoods with R1 and R2 zoning since this version of the city of Ottawa existed. So the issue is about leveling the playing field and putting more unit diversity through the zoning in more parts of the city. But it's really important to remember, just because it's zoned to permit, that doesn't mean it's ultimately going to be built. And there are market forces dictating what's ultimately built. And the city does not unilaterally have the power to force that to change. But what we have to do is create the buffet of zoning choices so that a variety of unit types can be built in more areas of the city. And that's what the new plan does.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate it. And I want to thank you for your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Leeper.
Some questions on numbers, Steve. The growth management strategy that we have was intended to get us to an increase in population of 400,000 people over the course of 25 years, with a combination of, half and half intensification and greenfield. You felt that the numbers are going to be challenging to reach with the growth management strategy that we have, but that's the official plan that we've adopted. When you were putting that GMS together, did you contemplate a scenario in which 4-story multi-unit dwellings would be allowed on any residential lot? If that were the case, does that change your math?
So chairs, Mr. Wise is on the line and might be able to assist me and back up what I have to say. I mean, during the growth management phase, we didn't go down to looking at how zoning would necessarily deploy back. We modeled how it would go, and we modeled the rate at which units would turn over based on housing, houses getting old, that they get knocked down or replaced with something new. And we did that. And we also looked at historic infill patterns and what it is. And they oscillate a lot. Like we have some really high years, like last year was a very high year, and some years that are low. And there's no consistent trend. It goes up, down, in terms of based on market conditions. And so the growth management numbers were based on a longer trend line over time to see what we could accomplish. And it certainly did not assume 4 units on every R1 lot in the city, for example. We always assumed we could only take some of them in time. So David, I don't know if you want to add to that, or if you think I've captured it at a high level.
If I may, the second assumption I wanted to delve into was around the R1s and whether or not those would remain R1s, and assumptions made around that in putting together the GMS numbers.
So in the final version of the GMS, you'll recall that staff were pushing for more intensification on minor corridors. And as a result, at the last minute, we made some compromises in not being as aggressive on that. That was a last minute compromise with council. There is no assumption that all R1 would change. Some would change when they have a proximity to a transit station, proximity to a well-served transit corridor. Yes, that would be assumption. We talked about the perimeters of neighborhoods rather than the core of neighborhoods is where that would be generally directed. And these details will be worked out in the zoning plan.
But if the provincial or if the task force's recommendations were to become legislation and R1 were to be eliminated, that would represent a very significant leap over intensification potential in Ottawa compared to what you anticipated in the course of putting together the growth management strategy assumptions.
Well, Chair, I'll go back to the point I made earlier, which is it's one thing to zone it and it's another thing to have that actually convert to units. So for example, I think it'd be highly unlikely that I would be unlikely that a house in Alta Vista, in the core of Alta Vista, just because it's zoned to be a 2 or 3 units would necessarily change because it's a very desirable form that it's currently in. It may be some. I mean, our projections are that, you know, the turnover rate in neighborhoods of older building stock is like 0.5% a year. Maybe in Councillor Leeper's own ward, it's closer to 1% a year. Old Ottawa South was used as an example where it's because there's a large vacant, underutilized former institutional use, you had a much bigger turnover because of that. But on the building stock that has historically existed, it's only 0.5% or 1%. And that's even with zoning that permits more. So we always have to take into account the, you know, to make up a term, a conversion rate of how much are people taking advantage of the zoning.
And that, so I guess where I go with all that is, do we need policies that are as aggressive as what the task force has recommended in order to achieve a slightly or a higher level of housing supply than what we've already contemplated in the course of doing our official plan?
So chairs, monitoring is really, really important. And that's why when council adopted the official plan, they had us do a regular report back on monitoring to see how we're doing on intensification, how we're doing on population growth. We don't yet know whether these macro Ontario population trends are going to affect Ottawa in the same way that they're going to affect the Greater Toronto area. It's too early to tell. The data isn't clear yet. We don't know. So we need to monitor. And if we have not gone, if we're not keeping up, council will have to go back and revisit, either accelerate the intensification permissions or add land. Those are the two things council can toggle with. But, you know, that's why, and you know, when we adopted the growth management strategy 2 years ago, we weren't facing the same situation we are today. Things have changed a lot in 2 years. But is it a 2-year trend? Is it a 5-year trend? Is it a 10-year trend? You know, we don't know yet. So that's why monitoring is crucial.
Okay. I'm interested in the some of what I'm reading in the task force report. There's been a remarkable calmness in today's meeting and overall about the elimination of R1 zoning. I think what has a lot of people, certainly in Kitchissippi ward, concerned is not that R1 zoning might be eliminated, which seems to be the direction in which North America is heading in order to help address some of the supply issue. But what's really concerning is that instead of just more intensification, as we contemplated in our official plan, the pendulum might swing all the way to 4 stories, as of right, multi-dwelling units on every property in Ottawa with no appeal rights. That seems to be the most important sticking point of what the task force has recommended. And I'm just interested to see, because we may not need to go down the path of 4 stories multi-dwelling units on every residential property in Ottawa if R1 is eliminated, just given that I think that would allow for significantly more intensification than we had counted on when we did our growth management strategy a couple of years ago. Yeah, so I mean, the math, how close are you to being able to model any of this out in terms of what it might mean for our growth management strategy if these proposals were to be codified into law?
Chairs, because of the speed at which the release of the task force report, us getting a report to council so council could adopt its permission, there's no way we could model what it means. And you know, let's face it, many of these recommendations are extremely controversial in many parts of Ontario. So I would not, wouldn't seem appropriate to until we see what happens with the legislation to go there. But again, you know, if the legislation changes, we are doing regular monitoring reports. We can talk about the implication of wherever the legislation lands on this. And I think that would be appropriate timing. I mean, the staff will continue to track this file for council.
I think some of that, as we go into actual legislation committee hearings, the drafting of the final law is going to be critical. And it is interesting. I mean, we're having one discussion here in Ottawa, which is a pretty progressive jurisdiction with a strong understanding of what intensification means. There are, you know, I'm guessing municipalities that are even higher R1 levels in some of those GTA communities who obviously are not going to embrace an end to R1 as easily as Ottawa might, if we even do so. Okay, thank you very much, Chairs.
Chairs, if I may, it's really important for listeners to understand that we have not in any sense in the previous official plan done a blanket reversal in R1. We have talked about tactical changes, and people will see more details when the zoning comes. And I want to reassure anybody who's listening and may not understand the conversation that it has not been Ottawa's position to eliminate R1.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Brockington.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Mr. Willis, for reconfirming that statement. Certainly I don't have direction from my community for that elimination. I certainly did not run on that. And I think that part of the comprehensive zoning bylaw review is I'm very open to conversations, even in R1 zones where that would be appropriate or could be appropriate. But we have to be very clear with what we're messaging to the public today. Just on the question of AMO, I'll just, Chair, give a 1 minute update and then I'll yield the floor. So AMO as of March 1st, issued a statement that said they've provided the province with their comments with respect to the task force report. The pandemic has exacerbated the urgency of addressing the housing affordability and supply crisis in Ontario. AMO has been actively involved in housing and homelessness work for years, including the housing blueprint. We are, AMO, well positioned to provide advice on what is necessary to address the housing crisis affecting our communities. So there's much more there, but on March the 1st, AMO submitted this paper to the province. This is AMO's response to the task force report, and I did circulate that to all members of council. And the month before, AMO had a blueprint for action, an integrated approach to address the Ontario housing crisis. And again, any member of council wants that report. That's a pretty detailed report. This is a top priority for AMO, and they have absolutely been engaged and active. And the City of Ottawa, I'm not referring to myself, has a good representation at AMO, that is city staff who participate on a number of working groups, including housing. So I do want to recognize and acknowledge city staff in this regard as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Riley. I have that report printed out next to me here too. It's a good overview. Councillor Egley.
Thank you very much. And I apologize if someone's already brought this subject up. I had to step away for a few minutes, but I'm particularly concerned, Mr. Willis, about staff's response to the increase in appeal fees. I've already had instances where members of my community have had to crowdsource or crowdfund enough money to launch an appeal, and that's at the old numbers. If they go up to anywhere near $10,000, my sense is that, most people won't even bother trying. So I know there's a comment in the report, but I may have missed it in the discussion, but we haven't offered an alternative to that recommendation, say that it should stay at 400, or if to go up nominally to take into account perhaps additional costs of the hearing body. But I'd like to hear you on that, because I think $10,000 for an appeal is going to price out community associations, neighborhood groups, and just, you have an appeal on paper, but in practice, it will almost never happen. So I'd just like to hear what your position is on that, and whether staff are prepared to make it abundantly clear to the province that we think that's just a step too far.
So, Chair, the comment staff made is we are concerned about that cost is prohibitive. That's what staff's position was. So nothing the councillor said I disagree with. In all fairness to the province of Ontario, because like us, they look to recover the costs within programs and fees. I think I understand why the province may need to look at the fee structure in order to get that growth in OLT that we all know they need to do. The province has under-resourced OLT, and that's not just the current government. This has gone on for decades, actually, and there's been a further and further backlog, and Mr. Mark can probably advise you about how much longer the process is taking just to get hearing time over where it once was, somewhat exacerbated by the pandemic, but it's a longer term trend, and we do need more OLT support in Ontario. And we also in the past have advocated that there be a separate OLT panel that deals with Eastern Ontario. So Ottawa and all Eastern Ontario files don't get in line behind Toronto files, so that things can happen in a timely way here. And we think that's beneficial for the process. So, you know, when we as staff are going to come to council and say set a fee based on cost recovery, staff can hardly criticize the province if they would use the same methodology. But that being said, council can take any position it wishes and will revise accordingly.
Oh, and I appreciate that. I guess though, well, you know, usually what we try and do though, if we're doing that at the city level, we give people notice. There's a break-in period. There's an adjustment period. It's graduated over time if we can do that at all. It just seems to me that a jump from 400 to 10,000, you know, in one giant leap, will just make it unaffordable for groups to go forward. So I'll just leave it there. I think Councillor Menard may be trying to move something at some point in that regard. I'll just leave it there, but again, I think it'll make it. I hear what you're saying, Mr. Wilson. I appreciate that. I just think that it's too much in one step, even if that is the rationale. And it will force people away from the table in terms of, you know, legitimate groups that want to bring forward appeals. Thank you.
Chair, if I may just respond, there in no way do staff think that the 10,000 number is appropriate, just to be perfectly clear. But, you know, the 400 probably does not provide the resources to the panel to do what the recommendations of the report are. So we don't know what the right number is, and only the province can tell us what that right number is, but we are concerned, and that's what we said in the staff report. If council wishes to take stronger language, I'm more than happy to take direction from council.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor, Co-Chair Moffat is next.
Thanks. I don't have any questions to staff, so I just figured I'd come in at the end just to make some comments before we get to motions and wrapping this all up. But just on the report, I mentioned earlier when a delegation was speaking that I don't believe the folks that are writing to us and saying we should just dismiss the staff response and accept the recommendations in whole. I mean, that's not actually what we're being asked to do. I mean, this is a consultation. This is exactly what we should be doing, is responding to these and providing feedback back to the province and to Councillor Gower's amendments, you know, having that engagement level with the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing to make sure that we're getting some of our main points across. I do think there's some good in this. I mean, to be clear, it's not a task force on affordable housing. It's a task force on housing affordability. And I know that to many that might seem like, you know, potato, but to all of us, we know that there's a difference. But there are some points in this on affordable housing. I think one, you know, in past months, myself, Saeed, Saya, and have met with Councillor McCanny and Fleury to talk about community improvement plan. One of the key things of that would be looking at, you know, potential waiver of fees. Well, that's covered in a potential waiver of development charges on affordable housing projects that would guarantee affordable housing for 40 years. The tough thing is, what's the definition of affordable housing? We struggle with that here. We've been asking for a better definition of affordable housing so that we understand what that means. You're not just going to waive development charges unless you fully know what affordable housing definition is being used. But at the same time, there's the preceding clause, or the preceding point was a waiver of development charges for infill housing. Well, our official plan seeks to have much of our growth over the next 25 years be infill housing. To waive all development charges for infill housing is going to drastically impact how we can grow and how we collect money, because we're going to have to then go back to the taxpayer for these funds, and that's a concern. So there's some good and there's some that doesn't make sense, and that's kind of the point I was making earlier with Bill 68, the Modernizing Ontario's Municipal Legislation Act from a few years ago, as well as Bill 73, the Smart Growth for Communities Act. They had some points in it that were good, but they also had some points where it just didn't make sense from a municipality's perspective. And so you need to see changes to those, and hopefully we will get some changes to those things. You know, I think the comments about the the filing fee, there's no question that's something that needs to be addressed. I know there are some groups out there that will appeal as a means to delay, but I don't think we can just lump every single appeal together as being frivolous. In reality, the tribunal has the ability to assess frivolity by assessing the charges back to the appellant if they so choose. So the ability is already there to address that concern. You don't need to address it at the start by almost making it impossible for them to appeal in the first place. There's some funny ones. Number 15 was about the delegated authority, making councillors' delegated authority to staff mandatory. That kind of is an oxymoron, because if it's not delegated, then it can't be delegated authority if it's mandatory. Anyway, so some things just don't make sense in the report. You might want to call it something else, but I mean, the whole point of it being delegated is that it can then come back to a councillor. If it's mandatory, then it's no longer delegated authority. I'd be interested to see, we're expecting a response back from the province on our official plan. It's interesting to see how they respond to certain things. I think we all know when we approved our official plan, we made changes to cap building height on minor corridors. Well, that 4-story building cap on minor corridors, which is in our official plan submission to the province, goes against the task force recommendation of 6 to 11 stories in those same areas. It'd be interesting to see how the province responds to our official plan, and if they make amendments to that. Because if they make amendments to that, then you know where this is going to go on the task force. If they accept the 4-story cap that we put in place, then there's clearly room for negotiation on how this task force process goes forward. On exclusionary zoning, I'm going to touch on this one last. It's definitely not staff's position. It has been mine. I've been clear on that I think the path forward is ending the exclusivity of single dwelling units in the city. I think that's how you get to 60% and beyond. Because, we had motions to get to 70%. We had requests to get well beyond that. You can't get there if your predominant zone in the residential area is a single dwelling unit zone. And it doesn't mean that you're eradicating single dwelling units. It's still a permitted use. You're just eradicating the exclusivity of it, which I think is important. And I've always said, what I said during the official plan process was that the biggest risk next term is not implementing the official plan in the zoning bylaw. If the province steps in like California did and eradicates the exclusivity of single dwelling units, it actually does council a favor, because it actually helps us get to the point where we can get to without the concern of politics getting in the way of implementing our official plan. To me, that's always been the biggest concern. To implement the official plan is the pushback that we will conceivably or inevitably get to getting rid of the R1 zone. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen from an upper level of government coming in and imposing it on the city. I realize that might not be appetizing. I think that's probably why it's there. This council, I don't believe today, would support eradicating the R1 zone. I don't even think they'd support eradicating 50% of the R1 zone. So if you don't do that, then you're going to come back in 2026 and you're going to expand the boundary, because you're not going to have had the intensification that you need. So that's a tough one. I think staff's response on that is proper, because you're still open to it. You're still open to the discussion. And I think we have to be open to that discussion, because I think it's a big risk, like I said. So I don't think I have anything else to say. I think Councillor McKenney had their hand up for a bit, but we're gonna get to motions shortly. So I'll just put it back to the chair and go from there. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Scott. I want to add just a few things and wrap up. Quite great questions from councillors to staff and good presentations today. Just a few things that I wrote down in the course of this. I've said this before, we should be renaming this committee to the Planning and Housing Committee to better reflect our responsibility as a committee and as a council. Our focus should be on addressing the housing crisis. Councillor Fleury mentioned concerns about infrastructure and amenities. I think it's one thing that we have to be cognizant of. If we're going to be building 1.5 million homes in Ontario, doubling the rate of growth, we also need to have financial tools from the province in order to keep up on the amenities, the servicing, the roads, the transit, the community centers, but also a focus on complete communities. We need more than just homes in order to have a healthy, livable community. I realized the report was really focused on housing ownership and the affordability of housing ownership. but I think it does a disservice to not consider renters. I think we have to think about housing as finding a place for people to live, whether they own it or whether they rent it. Housing is a right. And I know councillors Eglai and Menard and McKenney and others touched on this in various ways. Councillor Kavanaugh brought up the gender lens in this. I think that's important. I don't think the provincial report touched at all on, well, actually it did, but almost in a cursory way. We have to acknowledge that there are significant inequities faced by marginalized people, by Black, Indigenous people, by racialized groups and other marginalized people who have real problems accessing housing in this environment. Councillor Moffat, I think you were touching on this a bit, the accountability between different levels of government. And the provincial report touches on this too. You know, the federal government, for example, sets immigration targets and then kind of leaves it up to cities to figure out where people are going to live. The provincial government sets policy and legislation, and then it's up to us as a city to implement it. I think if you ask the average person, you know, how much involvement does the province have in planning approvals? They'd probably say none. They really look to city council and city councilors as the political level that's accountable for how our city is growing. But I'd like to see the province take on some more accountability in how they are introducing, how they are managing policy and introducing legislation. We need to find a balance. Councillor Kitts and Councillor Leeper both touched on this. We do need to accelerate residential growth, but not at the expense of good city planning and local context. And I mentioned earlier, we need to make sure we're in our consultation and our deliberations that we're listening to current homeowners, but we have a way to include renters and future owners in our consultation and deliberations as well. Overall, I'm glad we are talking about this. I believe that the biggest risk right now, it is largely political, and it's because development is happening very quickly, and we just spent 3.5 hours discussing this at committee. I don't think there's still a big enough appreciation of what this housing crisis and this affordability crisis is in our communities. I think if I ask the average person in Stittsville, and I imagine it's the same in many wards, they're just saying development is happening too quickly, please stop it. And there's a number of reasons they hold that opinion, but we need to be doing more as city councilors, and I think every level of government needs to be doing more to kind of socialize what the housing crisis is and how we need to address it and why we need to address it. And I'll just end with that. I'm really concerned that we still haven't broken through to the general public's consciousness as to the serious steps and the significant moves we're going to need to make to address this. And with that, I will hand it over to Co-Chair Moffat to take us through the motions.
Thank you very much. So as far as I know, we just still have the 5 motions. I don't think I've seen any have come up since then. We have we'll start with the motion from the co-chair, Councillor Gower. I'll just read the final resolution of them as we go. So therefore be it resolved that recommendation 3 of the report be revised to read, request that Mayor Watson and the co-chairs. Oh, Councillor McKenney, did you want to jump in before, or you want to speak to a motion?
I just want to speak to this motion, but very quickly.
Okay, yeah, no worries. Request that Mayor Watson and co-chairs of Planning Committee on behalf of Council make representations to the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, detailing the city's position with a focus on 1, increasing provincial support for affordable housing, 2, ensuring that meaningful public participation and engagement in the planning process is maintained, 3, maintaining local context considerations, including the importance of heritage protections, and 4, maintaining equitable Ontario Land Tribunal appeal rights for residents and community groups. Councillor McKenney.
Thanks, Chair. I just, and I was already in discussion with Chair Gower. I just wanted to add on to number 1 as a friendly amendment, affordable housing and supportive housing. The province is largely responsible for funding supports, especially for supportive housing, and I just think it's important that we just recognize that we need supportive housing in order to eventually eliminate chronic homelessness. So, friendly amendment to just add to number 1 and supportive housing.
Absolutely. I think Councillor Gower sees that as friendly. So we'll add that to the number one. So it'd be increasing provincial support for affordable housing and supportive housing. Councillor Kavanagh.
Yeah, hi. As I was in conversation with Mr. Willis, and also Chair Gower also mentioned it as being important, is about the gender lens and about this is an opportunity to raise that. I don't have wording for it, but if we can include in there that the mayor raises the issue of the gender lens in housing and how important it is in terms of affordability and what is needed in the overall strategy.
I mean, without going through the motion and rewording it with every comment, Councillor Gower and I are listed on this motion as being two that would do that. I'd be happy, I think Councillor Gower would too, to take that as a direction from you to make sure that we do raise that.
Oh, that the mayor will raise it.
Mayor and ourselves.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, because it is the three of us.
Okay, all right. Appreciate it.
Councillor McKinney?
Sorry, just on gender, I think it's really important to include and equity. We need to make sure that there's an equitable lens to gender as well. So,
absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
And feel free in the meantime, to provide any information to us, Councillor Kavanagh, McKinney. Send an email to myself, Councillor Gower, to be specific as to where you want us to focus on that type of thing to raise. We'd be happy to do that for you.
For sure. Thank you.
No worries. So on that motion, as amended.
Carried.
Thank you. So we'll go through. I'm probably not going to read them in the order that Councillor Fleury introduced them in, but I will go through them. So the first one on Ontario Land Tribunal. So remember, these are coming from Councillor Leeper, but are truly from Councillor Fleury. So the first one on the Land Tribunal. Therefore, be it resolved that Council requests the Solicitor General to create an Eastern Ontario Land Tribunal to address the backlog and allow for timely reviews in Ottawa. And therefore, be it further resolved that following the city's recommendation, this Eastern Ontario office include an office to advise community organizations or other stakeholders on the mechanics of filing a proper appeal. They used to have that, but they got rid of it. They used to have that. So we'll see. Any questions on that? Seeing none, is that carried?
Carried.
Next motion on public lands. Again, Councillor Leeper Fleury. Therefore be it resolved that the city requests the province of Ontario, based on the Affordable Housing Task Force recommendations, the Housing Affordability Task Force, which should read, include renewed policies to easily transfer provincially owned lands within Ottawa to unlock housing options on vacant or empty provincial properties. Empty, it sounds so, including Crown agencies such as LCBO, MTO, and school boards. Councillor Brockington?
Two minor proposed changes. One is the empty word, take that out. After provincial properties, add deemed surplus. And then following that, it says, including Crown agencies. I would just close it off there. The MTO is not a Crown agency. School boards are not Crown agencies. If you want to include Crown agencies, just say that and eliminate the rest. It's all included in the whereas statements. And I can assure you, we don't want to get into a war with school boards. The main theme here is if there are deemed surplus provincial lands, we would like to have that conversation to build affordable housing. But those are my two minor editorial changes.
Yeah, that's fair. Councillor Fleury?
I'm fine with removing empty. I am careful on the declaration of surplus. The declaration of surplus has meaning, and I will get out of the politics of school boards and get into the politics of MTO. MTO does have a number of lands along the 417. They will never be used or developed and never be declared surplus. That's the reason why I'm not using that word. So it's important that we actually trigger a provincial review of the lands they own and come back. Obviously, they have their own governance and their own diligence. So I'm not trying to get into, Councillor Brockington's point around school boards, schools is fair, but we have in the core I have 3 schools that have been vacant for 3 decades. So to me, the province, I'm asking the province to take a look at lands they own and across agencies. Because if we go to, I'm giving an example, and I think the motion refers to that. So I guess I'm responding to, I'm okay with the removal of the word empty, but I would like that we keep the words crowns and various lands, because, and not add surplus. The surplus is a specific process provincially.
Okay, then just remove such as, because then it's because it's not, as Councillor Brockington had said, you have things here that aren't examples of crown agencies. So then you'd have including crown agencies, LCBO, MTO, school boards. Maybe you want to put et cetera.
Et cetera. That's right. I'm good with that. And I apologize for this is doing it on the fly here. So thank you for the recommendation.
No worries. So just at the end, then it would instead read lands within Ottawa to unlock housing, options on vacant provincial properties, including crown agencies, LCBO, MTO, school boards, etc. So it's not exactly what Councillor Brockton was asking for, but it's a change. So any other questions on that? Seeing none on that motion, is that carried as amended?
Carried.
Carried.
Thank you.
Carried.
If the clerk's office needs wording from what I just said verbally, just send me an email. The next one on site plan process. Again, Fleury and Leaper, therefore be it resolved that committee direct staff to clarify in their report ahead of replying to the province the importance of site plan and its current review process in certain neighborhoods and communities that have been rezoned or are zoned residential fourth density and not exempt it from public consultations and input. Any questions on that? Seeing none, is that carried?
Carried.
Carried.
Thank you. And then finally on provincial policy statements. I realize the motion says PPS, but for anyone not knowing what that means, it's provincial policy statement. Therefore be it resolved that the City of Ottawa agrees that the province needs to lead a discussion on ways to remove exclusionary zoning that inhibits allowing a variety of housing types in neighborhoods in Ontario. The city encourages the province to adapt the provincial policy statement and issue best practices, but the City of Ottawa wants to retain the right to adapt any new standards to local conditions. I don't think this is overly different than what is already the process. The city does retain the permissions today to make decisions on its own behalf. When it comes to exclusionary zoning, we could do it now if we wanted to, but I don't think the motion by any means is out of order. It's just it's not a huge departure from what we already have in front of us today. Any questions on that? Nope, seeing none. Is that carried?
Carried.
Carried.
Great, thanks. And then I don't have the entire report right in front of me. So Councillor Garrett, I don't know if you have it. So if you want to just do the final report recommendations.
Yeah, I can bring it up here on my screen. There are 3 recommendations in the report. I don't think we need to consider them separately, but so on the report recommendations as amended, it was receive this report and approve the city's response to the 55 Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force recommendations. It's direct the general manager, planning, real estate, and economic development to submit the city's response to the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing. And we have amended item number 3, requesting that the mayor and the co-chairs on behalf of council make representations to the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing detailing the city's position. And we identified the 4 bullet points to focus on there. So are the report recommendations carried as amended?
Carried.
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 Okay, thanks everyone. It is 1:28 p.m. This has been a long meeting so far. So we're going to take a 10-minute break to let everyone reset, and then we'll continue with the high performance development standards. So let's be back for 1:40 p.m. and we'll keep going from there.